Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Bellicho. If you're just joining us, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. It means the world to us. Now I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you're at? Let me know in the comments. Today's story, we're diving into the untold horrors that park rangers face in the deep wilderness. The things they encounter, the things they witness, what they're forced to keep silent about. The truth they can never share. So stick around, keep the lights on, and let's explore what really happens in America's darkest forests. Don't forget, like, subscribe, and comment. This is Mr. Bellicho. Let's begin. My name is Brody, and I've been a ranger with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation for nearly 16 years. I work the northern section of Laurel Ridge State Park, a sprawling wilderness that covers over 22,000 acres of dense forest, steep ravines, and mountain terrain that hasn't changed much in the 3 centuries since European settlers first tried to claim it. Most people know these mountains as part of the Appalachian range, beautiful, unforgiving, and home to more folklore than any place I've ever been. I tell you this up front because what I'm about to recount will sound impossible. I don't blame anyone for doubting it. I doubt it myself some days. The morning of September 14th started like any other patrol. I was 38 years old then, in decent shape for a ranger, and I'd hiked every official trail in my sector at least a dozen times. I knew which streams ran year-round, where the black bears denned in autumn, and which hidden clearings the hunters tried to exploit during season. I thought I knew my territory. My radio crackled at 5:47 a.m. while I was still nursing my coffee at the ranger station. It was Patricia from the main office in Harrisburg. Her voice carried that particular tension that meant something unusual had happened. "Brody, we've got a report. A hiker called in about an hour ago from somewhere near the North Ridge. He was pretty agitated. Said he saw something that didn't look like any animal he'd encountered before." "What kind of something?" I asked, though I was already pulling on my boots. "That's the problem. He was rambling a bit. Said it was big. 7 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark hair. He claimed it was watching him from about 50 yards away across a ravine. Then it took off into the deep woods. He's a pretty reliable witness. Comes up here 4 times a year, knows the area. But obviously we need to check it out." I felt that familiar tick of adrenaline that comes with any genuine emergency in the wilderness. A lost hiker is one thing. An injured animal is another. But something that deliberately watches people, that was different. "Did he say where exactly?" "Near the old fire road about 3 miles northeast of where it connects to Laurel Trail. He's waiting there now. His name is Mark Henson. He's the one who called it in." I was already moving. The old fire road meant terrain I knew well, a network of paths that had been cut decades ago when the state still did regular controlled burns through certain sections of the park. Most of those roads had regrown or been officially decommissioned, but the routes remained visible to anyone who knew how to read the landscape. "I'm heading out now," I told Patricia. "I'll report back within the hour." The drive to the trailhead took 30 minutes. My truck bumped over the rough entrance road, and I parked near the weathered sign that marked the beginning of the Laurel Trail proper. The sun was just beginning to turn the sky from black to deep purple. The forest was absolutely still. That's one thing people don't understand about wild places. The quiet isn't peaceful the way city people imagine. It's expectant. It's the quiet of something waiting. I grabbed my field pack, which contained water, a first aid kit, a sat phone for emergencies, my Ranger issue sidearm, and my flashlight, though the sun was starting to rise. I also packed a paper map and a compass. Technology fails in the mountains, and I've learned not to trust anything too much out here. Mark Henson was waiting about half a mile up the trail, sitting on a large rock with his arms wrapped around himself. He was maybe 55, fit-looking, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. I recognized him from his previous visits. He was a bird watcher, I remembered. The kind of person who could spend hours perfectly still to catch a glimpse of a wood warbler. "Brody," he said, standing up when he saw me. "I'm glad you're here. I know how this sounds." "Walk me through it," I said, pulling out my notebook. "From the beginning." Mark took me about 200 yards up a side trail that wasn't officially maintained. The ground was rocky, covered with years of leaf litter. He pointed to a ravine that dropped away dramatically on our right. "I was just off this trail, actually," he said, gesturing about 30 feet to the east. I'd spotted a pair of pileated woodpeckers earlier, and I was trying to get a better look. It was still pretty dark, maybe 40 minutes before full dawn. I was standing right about there, where you see that cluster of hemlock. I moved to the spot he indicated. From that position you had a clear view across the ravine. The slope opposite was densely forested, but not so densely that you couldn't see movement. The sun was starting to come up just enough that I could see shapes, Mark continued, and then I saw movement. At first I thought it was a black bear. They're not uncommon around here, but then whatever it was stood up. Stood up, I repeated, on two legs, like a person but massive. It was dark, black or very dark brown hair all over. I could see its arms. Jesus, Brody, the arms, they were long, like twice as long as they should be proportional to its body. And the shoulders, it was just huge. Humanoid, but not human. I'd heard whispers about something like this over the years. Every park ranger in Pennsylvania knows the stories. The historical reports of a large bipedal creature in the Appalachian wilderness. The old Sasquatch sightings. The cryptid folklore that gets passed around like currency among the Park Service staff. I'd always thought of it as myth, the kind of story that makes for good conversation around a campfire but doesn't mean anything in the real world. How long did you see it? I asked. Not long, maybe 30 seconds. Once I saw it, once I really processed what I was looking at, I think the creature registered my presence. Its head turned toward me. I swear it was looking directly at me. And then it was just gone. It moved back into the forest so fast, easily, like running through open ground. I never heard it move. That was maybe the worst part. Something that size, moving through the woods without a sound. I was studying the ravine, trying to picture what he'd described. The slope opposite was steep, maybe a 45-degree angle. There were plenty of places to hide, plenty of paths where something could move undetected. Have you seen anything like this before? I asked. No, Mark said immediately. I've been coming to these woods for 30 years. I've seen bears, bobcats, coyotes, the occasional mountain lion on the very far side of the park. I know what wildlife looks like. This was different. This was something else. The sky was getting lighter. I could see better now, the forest beginning to reveal itself in more detail. I made a decision that in retrospect might have been foolish. I'm going to go take a look across the ravine, I said. You stay here, don't wander. I'll be back within an hour. Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded. I think he was relieved to not be alone anymore, but also relieved to not be the one investigating. I began making my way down into the ravine. The descent was steep enough that I had to move carefully, using small trees and rock outcrops as handholds. The forest floor here was thick with moss and decay, the smell of old growth and earth. The air was cooler down in the ravine, more humid. I could hear a small stream running somewhere to my left, though I couldn't see it yet through the dense vegetation. It took about 10 minutes to reach the bottom of the ravine. The stream was indeed there, more like a trickle than anything flowing, and the forest was even more densely packed than I'd expected. The light barely penetrated the canopy. I switched on my flashlight, though it was becoming less necessary as dawn progressed. That's when I noticed the first sign. On a large hemlock tree about 8 feet up on the trunk, the bark had been stripped away in a wide vertical swathe. The wood beneath was exposed, raw, and the stripped bark was scattered on the ground. This wasn't a normal animal behavior I was familiar with. Bears sometimes claw at trees, but not like this. This was something else, something purposeful. I was examining the damage when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration in the air, a deep resonant frequency that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, somewhere to the northeast, and it lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then silence. Every instinct I had told me to turn back, that visceral alarm that animals have, the ancient part of the human brain that keeps us alive. It was screaming at me, but I was also trained to investigate, to understand my territory, and to protect it. Those parts of me won out. I continued northeast, deeper into the ravine. The ravine system was more complex than I'd expected. What had seemed like one simple cut in the mountain revealed itself as a network of interconnecting gullies and stream beds, all feeding into a larger system that ran north toward what I knew was a major tributary of the Laurel Run. I marked my position with my GPS and continued moving carefully through the dense undergrowth. I'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I found the second sign. An entire section of forest, roughly 30 feet in diameter, was devastated. Trees were broken off at varying heights, the wood splintered and raw. Some were snapped at chest height for a large creature, others torn away entirely from their root systems and cast aside like sticks. The destruction was catastrophic and recent. The exposed wood was still pale, barely weathered. I'd seen weather damage before. I'd seen what happens when a storm tears through a valley. But this wasn't random. This was directed. This was something powerful moving through the forest with intention, taking down trees as it went. I pulled out my camera and documented everything. The forest here was dead silent. Even the birds had stopped singing. That absence of sound is almost louder than sound itself. I noticed something else as I was photographing the damage. Among the broken trees there were deep impressions in the earth, footprints. They were massive, at least 14 inches long, deeply indented into the soft forest floor. The spacing between them was wide, suggesting a long stride and a tall creature. Each print showed what appeared to be 5 toes, or at least 5 weight-bearing points, arranged in something roughly human-like but distinctly different. I measured the distance between prints, 7 feet. The creature was taking steps approximately 7 feet apart, which would put its height, judging by typical stride-to-height ratios, at around 9 feet. That number sat heavily in my mind. 9 feet tall. Nothing in North America was supposed to be 9 feet tall and bipedal. I took photographs of the prints, careful to include a reference object, my ranger badge for scale. As I was finishing, I heard something. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and one that seemed impossible coming from an animal. It was a kind of clicking or chirping sound, but far too loud, echoing across the ravine. It came from somewhere to the north, maybe half a mile away. It lasted for about 2 seconds, then stopped. I stood motionless, listening. The silence that followed felt absolute. My radio was on my belt, set to the ranger frequency. I should have called it in. I should have reported everything to Patricia and waited for backup. But something made me hesitate. I didn't want to make this official yet. Didn't want the questions and the skepticism and the full bureaucracy of the Park Service descending on this place before I understood what I was looking at. In retrospect, that hesitation cost me more than I can properly express. I moved forward, following the trail of destruction. The footprints were spaced out less densely now, suggesting the creature had shifted to a normal running pace once it cleared the area of downed trees. I could track it by the occasional disturbed foliage and occasional ground disturbance, but the signs grew fainter as it moved away toward the north. I checked my watch. It was 7:15 a.m. I'd been in the ravine for less than an hour, but it felt much longer. The forest had a quality to it that seemed to distort time. Every moment felt stretched and heavy. I came to a decision point. The trail was leading me deeper into truly wild country, territory that was beautiful and untouched, but where the risks of getting lost or injured were substantial. I was alone, with just a sat phone that would work only in open areas, and I still had Mark Henson waiting back at the ravine's edge. I decided to turn back. I marked my location with a plastic tag, took photos of the GPS coordinates, and began making my way back south. That's when I made a mistake. I was so focused on retracing my steps that I didn't notice how the light was changing. The sun, now fully risen, was shining through the canopy in sharp angles that made distance and depth difficult to judge. What I thought was the gully I'd come down turned out to be a different stream bed entirely. I realized I was lost. The panic was immediate but manageable. I'd been trained for this. I had a compass. I had a GPS unit. I had water and supplies. Being lost in the wilderness wasn't dangerous if you kept your head and followed basic survival protocols. I pulled out my GPS unit and checked my position, except the GPS unit wasn't responding. I waited 30 seconds and tried again. Nothing. Dead. I pulled the batteries out and reseated them. Still nothing. The unit, which had been working perfectly that morning, had simply failed. That's when I noticed my radio wasn't responding either. The frequency was static, but when I tried to transmit, nothing happened. Dead air, no carrier wave, no feedback. It was as if all electronic communication had suddenly been disabled in this one valley. This was not a coincidence I could accept. I took a deep breath and used my compass to orient myself. North was that direction. I needed to head south and east to escape the ravine system and get back to higher ground where the GPS might work. I began moving with more purposeful strides, being careful to mark my path mentally. I'd gone maybe 200 yards when I heard the first real sign of pursuit. It was a low rumbling sound, like someone dragging a large object through the forest. It came from somewhere to my north and west, maybe a quarter mile away. I stopped moving and listened. The sound stopped when I stopped. I started moving again, faster now. The sound resumed, and this time it was accompanied by a series of grunts or huffing sounds. heavy breathing from something large. I'm not ashamed to say that fear took hold of me at that moment. Pure visceral fear that bypassed all rational thought and went straight to my nervous system. My hands were shaking. My breath was coming fast. I resisted the urge to run. Running would trigger a pursuit response in any predator, but I moved quickly through the forest, climbing upward toward the ravine's edge. The sounds behind me grew closer. They weren't approaching directly, but tracking parallel to my path, as if something was circling. I could hear it moving through the undergrowth now, and the undergrowth barely rustled at all. Whatever it was, it could move through dense forest with incredible efficiency. I was moving upward now, my legs pumping, my breath ragged. I could see lighter forest ahead. I was approaching a ridgeline. If I could reach open high ground, I'd have better visibility and better options. That's when it happened. Something massive moved between me and the direction I was heading. It was huge, a wall of dark fur and muscle, and it appeared so suddenly that my brain took a moment to process it. I did see it for just a moment, long enough to confirm Mark's description. Bipedal, enormous, covered in dark brown or black fur. Its face was broad and heavy-featured, something between human and primate but not quite either. Its eyes caught the light from above, reflecting it back at me. We locked eyes for what felt like an infinite moment, then it vocalized. The sound that came out of that creature's mouth was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was a combination of a roar and a bellow, and that same clicking sound I'd heard earlier, but deeper and more resonant. It seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. I ran. I don't remember making the decision to run. I just moved, scrambling up the slope toward higher ground, not caring about technique or caution. Behind me I could hear it crashing through the forest in pursuit. For something so large, it was fast. Impossibly fast. I burst out onto the ridgeline where the trees gave way to more open, rocky terrain. The morning sun was blinding after the dimness of the ravine. I didn't look back. I just kept running along the ridge, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. After what must have been 5 minutes of hard running, I slowed down enough to look behind me. The creature was no longer visible. The forest looked silent and normal, as if nothing had happened, but I could still feel it. Somewhere in those trees it was watching me. I could feel its attention like a physical weight. I didn't rejoin Mark Henson until nearly noon that day. When he saw me emerge from the ravine, my uniform torn and dirty, my face scratched and bleeding from branches, he knew something had happened. "What did you find?" he asked, standing up from the rock where he'd been waiting. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't explain it. Instead, I said, "Wildcat probably. Must have been startled by you. They don't usually bother people." It was a lie, and I think he knew it, but he didn't push. We made our way back down the trail in silence. That evening, I filed a report with Patricia. I described what I'd found, the damaged vegetation, the impressions in the soil, but I left out the most important details. I didn't mention the encounter itself. I told her I'd seen signs of a large animal, possibly a mountain lion or a feral dog, and that I'd recommend increasing patrols in the area. She agreed to have someone check the damaged section of forest. For 3 days I couldn't work. I took time off, claiming I was sick. I actually was sick, physically and mentally. I couldn't eat properly. I couldn't focus. Every sound in the normal world made me flinch. I kept replaying that moment when our eyes met, trying to understand what I'd seen. On the 4th day, I went back out. I told myself it was to do my job, to investigate properly. In truth, I think I needed to confirm that what had happened was real, that it wasn't just some elaborate hallucination caused by stress or exhaustion. I went back to the ravine, but this time I took precautions. I went with another ranger, Dale Hoffman, who worked the southern section of the park. I didn't tell him what I was looking for. I said we needed to confirm the presence of a large predator. We found the damaged area again easily. The devastation was still there, partially hidden by the new growth and natural leaf fall, but unmistakable when you knew to look for it. Dale examined the damage with the professional eye of someone with 20 years of experience. "That's not natural," he said finally. "That's not storm damage either. Something did that." I didn't say anything. I was watching the forest around us, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. Dale found the footprints before I could show them to him. He crouched down next to one of the largest impressions, tracing the outline with his finger. "What the hell made that?" he said softly. "Don't know," I said. but I think we should get a wildlife specialist out here." Dale looked at me, and I saw the moment he began to understand that I wasn't telling him everything. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. "Since yesterday morning," I lied, placing the start date at my official investigation. "And you didn't call me in right away?" "I wanted to verify it was real first." Dale stood up, dusting off his hands. He was a good ranger and a good man, but he was also by the book in a way I'd never been. I knew he was going to escalate this. "We need to report this to Patricia," he said, "and we need to get real people involved, professional trackers, wildlife experts. If there's something out here that big and that aggressive, it's a safety issue." He was right, of course, but I felt an irrational resistance to the idea of outsiders descending on the area. The creature, because that's what I'd started thinking of it as, had shown itself to me. It had let me go when it could have done otherwise. I felt a strange sense of responsibility toward it, a need to protect it even from people who just wanted to study or capture it. That night I made a decision that I'm not proud of. I called Patricia and told her that Dale had overreacted to some normal wildlife damage. I said that I'd investigated thoroughly and found nothing of real concern. Just bear activity, probably, or possibly a large mountain lion, nothing that warranted outside investigation. Patricia wasn't entirely convinced, but she trusted my judgment. She told Dale and me to monitor the situation and report back if anything else developed. Dale wasn't happy about it, but he accepted the decision. He was still a professional, and if his senior ranger said there was nothing to worry about, he'd follow that guidance. What I didn't know at that time was that the creature had no intention of letting me be. The visit started 3 days later. I live in a house about 3 miles from the ranger station, on a small property with about 2 acres of land backed up against national forest. It's not isolated enough to be truly remote, but it's far enough away that neighbors are distant. When I'm home, it's just me and the woods. On the night of September 23rd, I was sitting on my back porch with a beer, trying to work through everything in my head. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I wasn't thinking about the creature at that moment. I was just trying to relax, to return to some semblance of normalcy. That's when I heard the sound. It came from the edge of my property, somewhere in the tree line about 200 yards back. It was that same vocalization I'd heard in the forest, the combination roar-bellow-click that didn't belong in nature. It echoed off the hills and seemed to come from everywhere at once. I was inside the house in seconds. I locked all the doors and checked all the windows. I called the local police non-emergency line and reported a disturbance, but I knew there was nothing they could do. By the time they arrived, the creature would be long gone. The sound came again around midnight, and then again at 2:47 a.m. Each time it came from a different location. The creature was circling my property, moving around the perimeter, making itself known. I didn't call anyone else that night. I sat in my house with all the lights on, my sidearm on the table next to me, and waited for dawn. This pattern continued for 4 nights. Each night the creature would vocalize from the tree line. Each night it would circle, moving from one side of my property to another. It never approached the house itself, never tried to break in or attack. It was as if it was demonstrating its presence, making a point. On the 5th night I did something that terrified me more than anything else could have. I took a rifle, my flashlight, and I walked out into my backyard and toward the tree line. "I'm here," I called out, my voice small in the darkness. "I know you're out there. I know you're real." There was no immediate response, just the sound of wind through the trees and the distant traffic on the road several miles away. "Why are you doing this?" I called out again. "Why are you following me?" That's when I heard it move, the sound of something massive shifting through the underbrush, moving toward me. I raised my rifle, but I didn't point it directly. I kept the barrel angled down, not quite ready to fire. The creature emerged from the darkness perhaps 50 yards away, just at the edge of where my flashlight beam could reach. It was on its hind legs, its massive frame silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. It was even larger than I'd remembered, with proportions that seemed to shift and change in the moving light. We stood there looking at each other, human and something other. I was terrified, yes, but I was also something else. I was curious about what this thing was, what it wanted, why it had singled me out. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "And I'm not going to tell anyone else about you. You have my word." The creature didn't respond. It didn't move. It just watched me with those dark eyes that seemed far more intelligent than any animal eyes should be. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, it turned and walked back into the forest. It moved upright, each long stride covering enormous ground. Within seconds it had disappeared into the darkness, and I couldn't even hear the sound of it moving anymore. It came back the next night, but this time, it didn't stay in the tree line. I'm going to be direct about what happened in the days and weeks that followed, because I think you deserve the truth, even if the truth is something that challenges everything you think you know about the natural world. The creature returned to my property every night for 2 weeks. Over that time, the visits changed. It no longer stayed at the tree line. It began approaching the house itself, moving around the exterior, and I began to understand that it was studying me the same way I was studying it. I started leaving food out, deer meat from a previous hunting season, fresh fruit, bread. The creature would consume it, always during the night, always when I was watching from inside the house. I documented these visits in a journal, writing down dates, times, weather conditions, and the creature's apparent mood or demeanor based on its vocalizations. My colleagues at the Park Service began to notice that something was different about me. I became increasingly withdrawn. I called in sick more often. When I did show up to work, I was distracted and haggard from lack of sleep. Dale Hoffman confronted me one morning, asking directly if I was using drugs or if something serious was going on. "I'm fine," I told him, knowing it was obviously a lie. I wasn't fine. I was in the process of my entire understanding of reality being fundamentally altered. There was a creature, an impossible creature that had established some kind of contact with me, a creature that left no physical evidence beyond the damage to the forest. A creature that seemed to exist in some liminal space between myth and reality. The scientific part of my brain wanted to capture evidence, video, photographs, tissue samples, but another part of me, perhaps the wiser part, understood that doing so would end whatever fragile communication had begun between us. On October 8th, 3 weeks into our strange coexistence, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my window being broken. Not smashed exactly, but deliberately broken. The creature had driven something, a branch or a log, through the glass of my bedroom window with enough force to shatter it completely. I grabbed my rifle and ran outside, my heart pounding. The creature was in my backyard, lit by the moonlight, and it was gesturing, actually gesturing with one long arm, toward the forest behind my property. "You want me to come with you," I said, understanding somehow exactly what was being communicated. The creature turned and began walking toward the tree line. When it reached the edge of the yard, it paused and looked back at me. I found myself moving toward it without consciously deciding to do so. I wasn't armed with anything except a flashlight. I wasn't afraid, or rather my fear had transformed into something else, something that felt close to compulsion. We walked into the forest together, the creature in front of me, moving slowly enough that I could follow. The night was clear and bright with a full moon, so I didn't need my flashlight. We climbed through the woods with the creature moving silently and me following as quietly as I could. We climbed for what must have been 2 hours, ascending through the forest until we reached a ridge I'd never been to before. The view from the ridge was spectacular, looking out over miles and miles of the Appalachian wilderness, unbroken forest stretching to the horizon in all directions. The moon cast everything in shades of silver and gray. The creature stopped at the ridge's edge and turned to me. It made several vocalizations, clicks and grunts that seemed to form some kind of pattern or language. It repeated the sounds several times, as if teaching me. I tried to replicate them, making sounds in my throat that probably sounded ridiculous to my own ears. The creature tilted its head, watching me, and I got the distinct impression that it was trying not to laugh at my poor attempts. We stood there on that ridge for hours, watching the sun come up over the mountains. The creature never touched me, never threatened me. It simply existed beside me, sharing the moment in a way that transcended any need for words. As the sun rose, the creature turned and looked at me directly. Its massive face was backlit by the dawn, its features just barely discernible. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't a simple animal. It wasn't a mindless creature of instinct. There was intelligence behind those eyes. Ancient, patient intelligence. "What are you?" I asked aloud, knowing I wouldn't receive an answer in any conventional sense. The creature made a sound that was unlike any vocalization I'd heard from it before. It was almost melodic, almost beautiful. It lasted several seconds, and as it resonated through the morning air, I felt something shift in my understanding of the world. I understood, in a way that I can't fully articulate, that this creature had been living in these mountains long before humans had arrived. That its kind had been here, hidden in the vast wild spaces, watching and waiting. that it had chosen to reveal itself to me for reasons I would never fully understand, but reasons that were important. When the sound faded, the creature turned and walked deeper into the forest. This time, it didn't look back. I made my way back to my house alone, arriving around 7 a.m. My property was destroyed, windows broken, everything torn apart as if an enormous storm had passed through. I didn't report the damage. I cleaned it up myself and told people that I'd had an incident with a wild animal. I resigned from my position with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation a week later. I told them I wanted a change of direction in my life, that ranger work wasn't for me anymore. They were disappointed but accepting. Within a month, I'd packed up my house and moved away from the area. I've been back once since then, about 6 months ago. I drove out to Laurel Ridge and hiked back to that ridge where the creature and I had watched the sunrise. I spent the night there hoping it would return, but it didn't. The forest was just a forest again, beautiful and wild, but without that presence that I'd felt before. I think it was letting me go. I think the connection between us had served its purpose, whatever that purpose was. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I wouldn't believe it if someone told it to me, but I'm writing it down because it happened, and because it matters. There are things in the world that we don't understand, things that exist in the spaces between our knowledge and our myth. The creature I encountered, whatever it was, wherever it came from, is one of those things. If you ever find yourself in the northern section of Laurel Ridge, in the deep forest far from the maintained trails, pay attention to the silence. Pay attention to the trees that show signs of age and damage that can't be explained by weather or disease. Pay attention to the feeling that you're being watched, because you might be. And if the creature reveals itself to you the way it revealed itself to me, don't be afraid. Don't reach for your camera or your phone. Don't try to capture it or contain it. Just listen to what it's trying to tell you, because in those mountains there are truths that go deeper than facts. There are old things that have been waiting patiently in the wild places, and they have stories that we need to hear. My name is Brody, and this is what I saw. I took the job because I had nowhere else to go. That is not entirely true. I had options. My uncle had room for me on his cattle operation outside Browning. My old supervisor in Missoula said the search and rescue team would take me back anytime I asked. A woman from college, who I had not spoken to in years, sent a card after the funeral and ended it with, "You know, there is always a place at our table." People are kind that way when something terrible happens. They open their doors a crack and they hold them open longer than is comfortable. What I needed was a door I could close behind me. Something solid, with a deadbolt, in a place where the silence was older than my grief. That is how I ended up at the Cinnabar Patrol Cabin, 11 miles up the North Fork, deep in Glacier National Park. 3 weeks after my wife was buried in the cemetery on the hill behind St. Mary. My name is Lawrence Graywater. My mother was Blackfeet. My father was a Welsh schoolteacher who taught math at the agency school, and the name on my driver's license is the kind that confuses people in airports. I am 34 years old. I served 8 years in backcountry search and rescue out of Missoula and another 4 with the National Park Service before they sent me here. I know every rope, every knot, every signal flare. I have spent more nights in a tent than in a bed. When I lost Anika, none of that helped. She was sick for 2 years. Pancreatic. We knew by the end what was coming, and we still pretended we did not. The morning she died, I was holding her hand, and the only thing I could think was that the hand felt wrong, that it was not her hand anymore, that something inside her had already left and I had missed it. For 3 weeks after, I did not sleep. I lay in our bed and I watched the ceiling fan turn and I listened for her breathing. My mother flew in, my sister flew in, the neighbors brought casseroles and then they brought guilt about the casseroles. I packed my truck on a Tuesday morning while my mother was still in the shower and I drove until the asphalt ran out and then I drove on the gravel until that ran out too. Glacier had a posting on the website. Backcountry Ranger, Cinnabar Cabin, October through April. Sole occupant. Weekly resupply by mule train. The job required someone with rescue training, off-grid experience, and what the listing called a comfortable relationship with solitude. Most rangers will not do the long rotations anymore. The pay is bad, the cell signal is nothing, the cabin has no internet, no electricity past a small solar bank, and a propane stove that, according to the briefing notes, Predates the Carter administration. I applied that afternoon. The regional supervisor in West Glacier called me back the same day. He had served with my late father-in-law in Vietnam, and he said as much. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said the cabin had been empty since August because the previous ranger had taken a leave of absence, and that he would be honest with me. The cabin had a reputation. People did not last long up there. 2 seasons was the average. He had seen rangers come down after a single winter and ask for transfers to anywhere with more sky. I did not ask why. I was on the trail by the 2nd week of September. The mule packer, an old Blackfeet man named Terry, 2 sons who had carried supplies to that cabin for 40 years, met me at the trailhead. He looked me over while he cinched the loads. He looked at the small framed photograph of Annika that was tucked into the side pocket of my pack. He did not say anything for a long time, and then he said, "You are going to hear things up there." I asked him what kind of things. He said, "Do not answer them." I thought he was speaking metaphorically, the way old men speak when they do not want to be understood by the wrong audience. I laughed, a little, and I said something polite, and we started up the trail. The ride to Cinnabar took 9 hours. The trail follows Spirit Creek for the first 6 miles, and then climbs through a burn from the 2017 fires, all silver standing snags and chest-high fireweed gone to brown. After the burn it enters living forest again, larch and lodgepole and spruce, and the canopy closes overhead and the light goes green, and it stays that way for the last 3 miles until the trail breaks open along the shore of Cinnabar Lake. The lake is smaller than I had expected, maybe 40 acres, surrounded on 3 sides by steep timbered ridges, open on the 4th to the north, where you can see, on a clear day, the white teeth of the Livingston Range. The cabin sits on a low rise above the eastern shore. Squat dark log walls, a tin roof, a single stone chimney, a wood-stacked porch, a privy out back, a small floating dock with a green canoe overturned on it. The whole place looked older than the trees. Terry unloaded the mules. He did not come inside. He stood on the porch while I opened the door, and he handed me the keys through the doorway without crossing the threshold. He told me to keep the porch swept, to stack the wood high before the first snow, and to lock the storm shutters at night. I asked, even in October. Especially in October, he said. He started back down the trail. About 50 yards from the cabin he stopped and turned and called something to me that I did not quite catch. I cupped my ear and asked him to repeat it. He waved his hand in a way that meant it does not matter, and he went on. And the mules went with him, and the sound of their hooves faded into the green dark of the trail. I stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone. The lake was very still. There were no birds. I went inside, I unpacked my food, I checked the radio. I split a small armload of kindling and I started a fire in the wood stove. I made coffee. I drank it on the porch and I watched the sun fall behind the western ridge and the water turn the color of an old bruise. When the light was almost gone, I heard something across the lake. It sounded like a woman calling a name. It did not sound like Annika. Of course it did not. I told myself that very carefully, the way you tell a child a story that is meant to keep him from going outside. I went in, I shut the door, I locked it. I did not open the storm shutters that night, and I did not sleep. That was the first day. The second week, I started keeping a logbook. The Park Service required it. Daily entries on weather, wildlife sightings, trail conditions, contacts with the public. The previous ranger had left her log on a shelf above the desk, a green cloth-bound notebook with the Park Service shield embossed on the cover. Her last entry was dated August 4th, written in a small, careful hand. It read, "Weather clear, light westerly wind, 2 tourists day-hiked from Bowman, gave them water. Heard the calling again last night, nearer than before. Will report on radio in the morning if it continues." There was no entry for August 5th. I asked the West Glacier office about her on my next radio check-in. The dispatcher, a woman named Rosalie who had been working that desk since I was in middle school, was quiet for a moment. Then she said the previous ranger had walked down the trail on August 5th and arrived at Pole Bridge that evening on her own 2 feet. She had asked to be reassigned. She had not said why. She had not gone into the field again. I asked Rosalie if I could have her phone number. Rosalie said no. She said it gently. She said, "Lawrence, that woman moved to Maine. She is selling antiques in a town with 1 stoplight. She is fine. Let her be fine." I said I understood. I did not understand, but I had been alone in the cabin for 10 days by then, and I was starting to understand other things. I was understanding the way the cold leans through the chinking after midnight. I was understanding the difference between a pine marten on the porch boards and a porcupine under the foundation. I was understanding that a lake, properly empty of human noise, has a sound of its own, a low, constant breathing in the reeds along the eastern shore. I was also understanding the calling. Terry had been right. I heard it most evenings, around the time the sun went under the ridge. Always from the far side of the lake, always a human voice, always saying something I could not quite parse from a distance. Sometimes it sounded like a woman, sometimes a man, once a child. I did not answer. The first hiker I had to deal with came on October 9th. He was a hunter. The North Fork sees a lot of them in early fall, slipping the line between the park boundary and the state forest where elk season is open. The boundary is not signed in many places. The kind of hunters who go up that drainage know it perfectly well. This one had crossed it deliberately, lost a blood trail, and then gotten himself turned around in the burn area east of the lake. He had been wandering for 2 days when his friend's beacon signal pinged, and the ranger station at Polebridge radioed me to meet him at the creek crossing. I shouldered my pack and went. The man's name was Joe Ferrer. He was in his late 40s, from a small town outside Spokane, an Idaho tag carry permit hunter who had crossed the wrong drainage. He was hypothermic, mildly, but mostly he was scared. When I found him, he was sitting on a deadfall above the creek with his rifle across his knees and his hands shaking. The rifle was not loaded. The bolt was pulled back. He had taken the magazine out and put it in his coat pocket, which is something a man does when he does not trust himself to be holding a loaded firearm. I got him warm. I got him fed. I walked him back to the cabin because Polebridge was 11 miles and dark was 3 hours out. I told him he could sleep on the spare bunk and I would walk him down in the morning. He thanked me. He drank 3 cups of coffee. He ate 2 cans of stew without speaking. Then he said, "Ranger, I have to tell somebody this, because if I keep it inside my head I am going to start drinking again." I sat down across from him. He said, "My hunting partner is not lost. My hunting partner is dead. He died last March, at home, in his recliner, watching a basketball game. I went to his funeral. I helped his widow clean out his garage." He said, "I came up here this week alone, but I have been hearing him in the trees for 2 days, calling my name, calling it the way he used to when we were younger, and he was trying to get me to hurry up because the light was going. He has been telling me where the elk are. He has been telling me to come this way, come around the bend, come up the draw." I almost did it. I almost answered him. The only reason I did not is because once yesterday he called and he got my mother's name wrong. He looked at me across the lamplight. He said, "Ranger, I am not crazy. I do not hear voices. I have never heard voices. There is something in this country that knows my partner's voice, and it is using it." I did not know what to say. I thought about the entry in the green logbook. I thought about Terry on the trail saying, "Do not answer them." I told Joe he was safe in the cabin. I told him to sleep. I told him I would walk him out at first light and that he should get his elk somewhere else next year, somewhere far from this drainage. He nodded. He went to the bunk. He lay with his face to the wall, and after a while his breathing went deep. I sat up at the table with the lamp turned low. Sometime after midnight I heard the calling start again. It came from the lake. It was a man's voice. It was speaking in Spanish. Joe's mother, the one whose name the thing had gotten wrong, had spoken Spanish, I assumed. The voice was calling in Spanish, the words mijo, ven acá. Joe did not stir. He was a deep sleeper, or he was pretending to be. I sat very still. I did not go to the window. I did not unlock the door. I watched the lamp flame and I counted my breaths, and I remembered something my grandmother had told me when I was 7, a thing she said in Blackfeet that I have never been able to translate cleanly into English, but which means, roughly, the woods know your name because you taught it to them, so be careful about the name you teach. The calling went on for almost 20 minutes, then it stopped. In the morning, Joe would not look at the lake. He walked down the trail in front of me with his shoulders up around his ears. He did not speak until we hit the trailhead at Polebridge. He shook my hand. He said, "You are a good man, Ranger." He said, "Do not stay up there." He got in his truck. I watched him go. I went to the small store in Polebridge and I bought a roll of duct tape and a box of nails and a tube of caulk, and I rode the supply mule back up to Cinnabar. I spent that afternoon caulking every crack in the cabin walls. It did not help. I knew it would not, but it was something to do with my hands. That was the second week. The first snow came on October 22nd, 3 inches overnight. The lake the next morning was steaming, the warmer water meeting the colder air in long pale drifts that hung over the surface like cigarette smoke. The world was hushed in that particular way new snow hushes things, where every footstep is a small soft theft. I was standing on the porch with my coffee when I saw the child. She was on the far shore, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the water, about 400 yards away, where the trail comes down out of the timber to meet the lake. She had on a red coat, no hat. Her hair was dark and long and tangled. She was looking at me. I do not know how long I stood there. I had been a backcountry ranger long enough to know what a child should not be doing. A child should not be alone, 11 miles in late October, wearing a coat that thin, sitting motionless on a frosted log. A child like that meant a parent who had been swept off in a creek crossing, or a family that had taken a wrong turn and split up, or, sometimes, worse. I called across the lake. I shouted, "Park Service, are you all right? Are you alone?" She did not move. She did not call back. I went inside fast. I grabbed my radio, my first aid kit, my emergency thermal wrap. I pulled on my coat. I went to the boathouse and flipped the canoe over and dragged it to the water. I was halfway down the slope to the dock when something stopped me. It was the calling. It was coming from inside the cabin. I had only been inside for maybe 40 seconds. I had left the door propped open with my coffee mug. The voice came from the kitchen, and it was a small voice, a girl's voice, a voice that sounded breathy and frightened and very small. It said, "Please, mister, please, my mom is hurt. Please come help." I turned around and looked at the cabin. I looked back across the lake. The girl on the log was still there. She had not moved. She had not moved her mouth, either, even when the voice was speaking from inside the cabin. I want to be clear about what happened next. I have replayed it in my head many times. I want you to understand that I am not the kind of man who panics. I have pulled bodies out of avalanches. I have done CPR on a child whose father was kneeling next to me screaming. I am not afraid of crisis. Crisis has a shape and a sequence, and you move through it. What I felt at that moment was not fear. It was something older. It was the feeling that I had stepped off a path I did not know I was on, and was about to step somewhere I would not be able to step back from. I turned the canoe over again and I dragged it back up to the boathouse. I did not go to the lake. I did not call out. I walked back to the cabin, and I went inside, and I did not look at where the voice had come from. The voice had stopped. The kitchen was empty. There were no tracks on the porch, no tracks in the snow, nothing on the floor. I went to the radio. I called Rosalie at West Glacier. I told her I had a situation, possible juvenile in distress on the far shore of Cinnabar Lake. I told her I could see the subject, I could not raise her by voice, and I needed a second pair of eyes on this before I crossed the water to make contact. Rosalie was quiet a moment. She said, "Lawrence, what does she look like?" I described the girl. Red coat, dark hair, maybe 9, maybe 10. Sitting on a log on the eastern shore. There was another silence. Rosalie said, "Are you sure, Lawrence? Are you sure that is what you are seeing?" I said yes. She said, "Give me a minute." She came back on the radio 4 minutes later. Her voice had a thinness to it that I had never heard from Rosalie in all the years I had known her on the air. She said, "Lawrence, the last child reported missing in that drainage was in 1987. Her name was Genevieve Renier. She was 9 years old. She was wearing a red coat. She walked away from her family's campsite at the foot of the lake. They never found her. Her mother died last year in Colorado." She said, "Please do not go to that shore." I told her I would not. I went to the window. The girl was gone. Where she had been sitting, the log was undisturbed. There was no impression in the snow. There were no footprints on the bank. The reeds at the water's edge were not bent. I walked the perimeter of the cabin in a slow, careful circle, my hand on the radio and the radio on my belt. I checked every window. I checked the sled shed, the woodpile, the privy. Nothing was out of place. Even my own boot prints from the morning were still there, frozen in the dawn snow exactly as I had left them. I went back inside. I closed and barred the storm shutters. I did this in the middle of the day because Terry had told me to lock them at night, and I did not care any more about the rules he had given me. I made a meal I did not eat. I sat at the desk and I wrote in the green logbook the longest entry I have ever written in any logbook in my career. That night I did not sleep. Around 2 in the morning, the calling started, but it had changed. It was coming from the porch. It was using my voice. It was calling Annika's name. The voice was perfect. It was every register of my voice, the soft sleeping voice and the angry voice and the voice I used to use when I came home from a long shift and sat down at the kitchen table while she made tea. It was calling her name again and again, the way I had called it the morning she died, when I had been holding her hand and felt the wrongness of it and known that I was alone. I sat on the floor with my back against the bunk. I held my knees. I put my hands over my ears. It called for almost an hour. Then, just before dawn, it stopped, and a single set of footsteps walked away from the porch and into the snow. In the morning, I went out to look. There were no tracks, but the welcome mat at the door was turned around. The Park Service shield was facing the cabin instead of the trail. Something had stood there long enough to read it. That was the third week. I should have walked out then. I want to put that on the record because everything that comes after has the shape of an excuse, and I do not want it to. I had 3 weeks of rotation left. I had a working radio. I had the legal authority to abandon the post under threat to ranger safety. Rosalie would have backed me. The supervisor in West Glacier, the one who knew my father-in-law, would have backed me. I could have been out by sundown the next day. I did not leave. I am going to try to explain this, although I am not sure I can. There is a kind of grief that wants you to come down to it. It pulls you the way a current pulls you. After Anika died, I had 3 weeks of standing on the bank of that current and watching it go past me and feeling, the whole time, like I was supposed to step in. That is the thing about the woods. The woods will offer you what you want. The woods will offer you a voice. And after a long enough time alone, with nobody to remind you of the shape of yourself, you start to want what they are offering. I was 34 years old. I had been a ranger for 12 years. I had never, in any of the storms I had been in any of the rescues I had failed, in any of the bodies I had carried out, ever felt what I felt sitting on that cabin floor while my own voice called my dead wife's name from the porch. I felt seen. That is the obscenity of it. That is what I want you to understand. Whatever was out there, it was not just hunting me, it was offering me something. It knew what I had lost. It knew what I had been listening for, alone, for 3 weeks. And it was telling me, in my own voice, in the most intimate possible register, that my wife was on the porch, that my wife was waiting, that I only had to open the door. I am alive because I did not open the door. But I did not leave, either. I stayed because I started to wonder what it was. I started keeping a second logbook. A private one, in a small moleskin I had brought up for letters. I wrote down every voice, every time, every direction. I plotted them on the topographic map I had on the wall. The pattern that emerged was not random. The voices came from the lake on certain nights and from the timber on others. They came at certain hours. They never came in storm. They never came on the brightest moons. I started to think of it less as a haunting and more as a creature with habits, a creature that could be observed. The first week of November, the snow set in for good. The lake froze along the edges. I shut down all but the most essential radio checks. Rosalie called me twice to ask if I was all right. Both times I said I was. The second time she said, "Lawrence, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest. Are you hearing things up there?" I said, "Sometimes, the wind." I think she knew I was lying. She did not push. On the night of November 12th, I went out to meet it. I want to explain my reasoning. I had begun by then to notice something about the voice. It always arrived between 2 specific arcs of timber. There was a clearing on the south side of the lake, a small natural amphitheater of fallen trees where a microburst had taken down a stand of larch in 2014 and never fully grown back. The acoustics in that clearing carried, when I plotted the directions from which I was hearing the calling, the lines converged on that clearing. I did not believe anymore that something was using only voice to track me. I believed something was sitting in that clearing and listening. I wanted to see what it looked like when it was listening. I waited until the moon was new. I dressed in my best winter gear, the white overshell I used for tracking wolves. I wore a balaclava. I took my service weapon, a flashlight I did not intend to use, a thermal handheld scope I had borrowed the previous winter from a wolverine biologist and never returned, and a small pocket recorder. I left the cabin at 1 in the morning. I went quietly, the way my grandfather had taught me to go through timber, putting my heel down first and rolling the foot. I crossed the frozen edge of the lake. I went up into the south timber. I came at the clearing from the backside, downwind, where the slope rose and the deadfall was thickest. I lay in a snowbank above the clearing. I lifted the scope. I want to say what I saw very carefully. It was not a costume. It was not a deer. It was not a man. I have spent 20 years in the wild country of 3 states. I have seen lynx and bear and mountain lion and once in the yak, a wolverine close enough to touch. I have never seen anything like the thing in the clearing. It was sitting up, not standing, sitting on its haunches with its legs folded beneath it the way a dog sits when it is being patient. It was the size of a yearling moose. Its skin in the green wash of the thermal scope registered as a heat profile I could not parse, mottled and uneven, as if parts of it were warm and parts of it were cold. Its head was small in proportion to its body. It had no face I could see clearly, only a long slit of a mouth that was wider than a mouth should be, beginning under one eye socket and ending under the other. It was singing. That is the word I have to use. It was making sounds, low and modulated, in a sequence. The sounds it was making were words. They were words in 3 languages I recognized, English and Spanish and what I think was Blackfeet. Although the Blackfeet was archaic and I caught only the cadence, they were rehearsing. It was practicing. It was sitting in the dark in that clearing, and it was rehearsing voices it had collected. I heard very clearly my own voice, saying Anika. I heard after that a child's voice, asking for help. I heard after that a man's voice, calling in Spanish. I heard after that a voice I did not know. An older woman. She was saying in English, "My keys are on the table." I lay in the snow for as long as I could stand it. I recorded everything. The thing did not move. It went on rehearsing for almost 40 minutes. Then, between one breath and the next, it stopped, and it turned its head, and it looked directly at the snowbank where I was hidden. I did not move. I did not breathe. It looked at me for a very long time. The scope showed me the slit of its mouth opening, slowly, like a wound. Then, in the voice of my dead wife, perfectly, in the small soft register she used in the mornings before I was fully awake, it said, "Lawrence, come to bed." I broke. I want to be clear about this. I did not run. Running would have killed me. I rolled backward off the snowbank. I went down the slope on my belly, the way I had been trained to break contact. I did not turn on the flashlight. I crossed the lake on the ice in a low crouch, and I did not stop until my hand was on the door of the cabin and the door was shut behind me and the bar was down. I was crying when I came inside. I had not realized I was crying until I tried to say something into the radio and could not. Outside, on the porch, I heard her voice say my name once more, then nothing. I sat against the door until morning. I left Cinnabar Cabin on the morning of November 14th. I did not radio my intent. I packed what I could carry. I left the rest. I left the green logbook on the desk, open to the last entry, which was a single sentence written in pencil. I do not remember writing it, but it was my handwriting and it said, "Do not stay here alone." I closed the storm shutters. I locked the door. I tied the canoe down with extra rope. I stood on the porch for a long minute and I said out loud in Blackfeet the words my grandmother had used to dismiss bad dreams when I was small. I do not know if they helped. They were not for the thing in the clearing. They were for me. I walked the 11 miles down to Pole Bridge in 7 hours. The trail was knee-deep in places. I broke trail with my snowshoes and I did not stop and I did not look behind me. 3 times I heard, in the timber off to the right of the trail, a voice. Once it was Anika. Once it was my mother. Once it was a man I have never met, calling me by name, asking me to come over and look at something he had found. I did not look. I did not answer. When I came out at the trailhead, Terry Two Sons was sitting in his pickup with the engine running. He must have known I was coming. I had not radioed. I did not ask how he knew. He looked at me and he looked at the empty space behind me on the trail, and then he opened the passenger door and I got in and he drove me to West Glacier without saying a word. I gave my report at the office that afternoon. I did not tell them about the clearing. I told them I had heard repeated unidentified vocalizations consistent with what the previous ranger had reported. I told them I believed the cabin should be closed for the winter, possibly permanently, and that the patrol route should be reassigned to a 2-ranger team if it was kept open at all. I told them I was not requesting a transfer. I was resigning from the National Park Service effective immediately. The supervisor, the one who had served with my father-in-law, listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was finished, he asked if I would be willing to talk to a counselor. I said no. He asked if there was anything he could do for me. I said yes, there was. I said, "Do not send anyone up there alone." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "Lawrence, I have been getting reports about that cabin since 1979. I have been pretending I do not understand them. I am going to stop pretending." He shook my hand. He said, "Go home. Whatever home means. I drove back to my mother's house in Browning that night. I have been here since. It has been 4 months. I have not heard the voice again. Not in town. Not at my mother's kitchen table. Not at the cemetery on the hill where I have started going in the afternoons, sitting on the bench somebody put there years ago for the people who come to talk to their dead. I want to tell you that this is the end of the story. I want to tell you that I came down off the mountain and the thing in the clearing stayed in the clearing and I am safe. I am not sure that is true. 2 weeks ago I drove down to the post office to pick up a package my sister had sent. On the way back to the truck in the parking lot I heard a man across the lot calling a child's name. I did not look up at first. Half the time here when somebody calls Lawrence, they are calling me, and the other half they are calling a cousin or a horse or a road. You learn to ignore it. But the man in the parking lot called the name twice more, and the second time, something in his voice slowed me down. The third time I looked. He was an older man, in a green coat, leaning against a Ford F-250 with the hood up. There was no child anywhere near him. He was not on a phone. He was looking straight at me. He was smiling. He said the name again very clearly into the cold air of the parking lot, and the name was Anika. I want to tell you that I confronted him. I want to tell you that I did anything brave at all. I got into my truck. I locked the doors. I drove home. I told my mother that night what had happened. She did not say I was crazy. She made tea. She sat with me for a long time and then she said, in Blackfeet, the line my grandmother used to say, "The woods know your name because you taught it to them." She added after that a thing I had never heard before. She said, and once a thing has learned a name, it will travel with that name. It will follow the name and not the place. I asked her what I was supposed to do. She said, you stop saying it. I have stopped saying my wife's name out loud. I have stopped writing it. I have stopped putting it in prayers. When I think of her, I think of her face and her hands and the light in our old kitchen. And I do not put a name on any of it. I do not know if it is working. The man in the parking lot has not been back. The voices have not been back. But sometimes, late at night, in the small hours, I will be lying in bed in the room I grew up in my mother's house, in a town where the street lights are bright and the neighbors are close, and there is no real wilderness for 100 miles in any direction, and I will hear, very softly from the other side of my closed bedroom door, somebody breathing. I will not get up. I will not call out. I will lie still in the bed of my childhood and I will count my breaths and I will wait for the sound to go away. It always goes away. So far, if you are reading this and you are a ranger and you are alone in a cabin in some country old enough to remember things older than you are, listen to me. The job will offer you what you want. The job will sound like the voices you have lost. The job will know you're dead. Do not answer. Do not open the door. Do not, no matter what name it knows, no matter what register of your own grief it calls you in, ever, under any condition, go to the lake at night. There is something on the other side of the lake. It is patient. It is collecting voices, and it learns very quickly the names you have been afraid to say. That is the end of what I have to tell you about Cinnabar Cabin. I do not know if I have given you a warning or only made the country more interesting to whatever is reading this over your shoulder, but I have done what Terry did for me on the day he left me at the door of that cabin and told me do not answer them. He gave me one sentence. I have given you several. Take from them what you can. And if, tonight, somewhere in your house, somebody you have buried calls you by name, please, do not answer. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is what happened in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania during the winter of 2021. I was working as a ranger for the National Park Service, assigned to monitor the remote northern sections of the sprawling forest that covers most of this region. But before I tell you what I saw, before I describe the thing that changed everything I believed about the world, you need to understand how I ended up alone on that mountain. I've been working in the parks for 18 years. Started when I was young, idealistic, full of dreams about conservation and protecting wilderness. My name is Gavin and I was good at my job. Too good, perhaps. That's why they gave me the assignments no one else wanted. The isolated posts. The dangerous terrain. The long stretches without seeing another human being. December 2021 was different. There had been reports coming in all autumn of something unusual in the northern forests. A hiker reported seeing a massive bipedal shape moving through the trees. A family camping about 15 miles from my station claimed they heard something outside their tent that made their dog refuse to come out for 3 days. These reports would have been dismissed as bears or misidentifications, except for one thing. I found the trail markers that convinced me something was very wrong. I was conducting routine maintenance on the hiking paths that crisscrossed through my territory when I found it. The path runs along Raven Ridge, overlooking a valley so deep that the floor disappears into shadow and mist most mornings. The maintenance work is tedious, methodical. I mark the damaged sections, take photographs, log GPS coordinates. It's boring work, which is why I liked it. In a job like this, you need your mind to settle. But that morning in late November, my mind wouldn't settle. The damage was extensive. Trees were torn apart, not snapped at weak points where wind would break them, but literally ripped from the ground. The roots were exposed, massive root systems simply wrenched from the earth. I'm talking about trees that were 4 feet in diameter, trees that would have taken a team of men with chainsaws hours to fell. Whatever had done this had done it with raw strength and apparent rage. I took my photographs, documented it thoroughly. The strange thing was the pattern. The destroyed trees formed almost a path, but not in any direction that made sense. They seemed to radiate outward from a central point, as if something had stood in the middle and tore everything around it apart in a circle, then inexplicably stopped. The next trees in the forest were untouched, pristine, as if the destruction had never happened. I should have reported it immediately. That's what the manual says. That's what any sensible ranger would do. Instead, I stood there for a long time, looking at that circle of destruction, feeling something stir in my chest that I couldn't quite name. I remember the wind was cold that day, much colder than it should have been for late November. It came from the north, carrying the smell of something I'd never smelled before. Something like an animal, but nothing like any animal I knew. It was rank and heavy, ancient in a way that doesn't make sense to describe. I filed my report. I documented the GPS location, attached the photographs, noted the unusual nature of the damage. The response I received 3 days later was administrative dismissal. Natural event, likely severe weather or animal behavior, no action required. That was it. A ranger supervisor in Harrisburg had looked at my pictures and decided it was nothing. Case closed. I couldn't let it go. The problem with working alone in the wilderness for years is that you become attuned to patterns in nature. You understand the language of the forest, and this pattern didn't make sense. Animals don't destroy trees like that. Weather doesn't leave evidence that looks like something's presence. By early December, I'd hiked to that site 4 times. 4 times I stood in that circle of destruction and tried to understand what could have done it. The 5th time I went out, I took extra gear. A better camera, a portable DNA collection kit I'd requisitioned years earlier but never used, detailed measurement tools. I made it sound official in my head, like I was conducting a thorough investigation. In reality, I was beginning an obsession. That day I found the prints. They were on the eastern edge of the destruction, pressed deep into what had been muddy ground. The mud had since frozen solid, preserving them in perfect detail. I stood above them for almost 10 minutes without moving, my hands shaking as I raised my camera. The prints were enormous, human-like, but enormous. I've seen bear prints before. I've tracked elk, dealt with wildlife my entire career. These were not bear prints. They were bipedal, which was the first impossible thing. They had 5 toes, clearly defined. The heel was deep, the arch high. They were the prints of something that walked like a man, but something that was not a man. Each print was 14 inches long. I measured them 3 times, certain I was making an error. 14 inches. If something that made a print that size was bipedal, if it had the proportions of a human being, it would be approximately 8 feet tall. I collected samples, soil, anything that might have biological material. I photographed the prints from every angle, took GPS coordinates, drew detailed sketches. My hands were shaking badly enough that the sketches were nearly illegible. I was cold, but not from the weather. I hiked out just before dark. The sun sets early in December in Pennsylvania, and I wasn't about to be on that mountain after nightfall. Not then. Not after finding those prints. The trek back to my station normally takes about 90 minutes. That night it took me 2 hours and 45 minutes. I kept looking over my shoulder. I kept listening. Several times I stopped, convinced I could hear something moving through the forest behind me, keeping pace. But when I would stand still and listen, there was nothing. Only the wind and the sound of my own panicked breathing. When I reached my station, I locked the door. I remember actually engaging the deadbolt, something I'd never bothered to do in the 3 years I'd been assigned here. The station is a small building, old but well maintained, built in the 1950s as a fire watch outpost. It's remote, at least 8 miles from the nearest human settlement. Before that night, I'd liked the isolation. I spent that evening reviewing my photographs. The prints were unmistakable, even in the images. They showed a gait consistent with a bipedal creature, each print pointing toward where the next would fall. The stride length was enormous, roughly 48 inches between each step. I created a spreadsheet with all my measurements, trying to estimate the creature's weight. Based on the print depth and the pressure evident in the frozen mud, I was calculating something in the range of 700 to 800 pounds. 700 pounds, 8 feet tall. Walking on 2 legs through the Appalachian mountains of Pennsylvania. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk with my files and my photographs, and I tried to convince myself I was making some kind of error, a misidentification. Pareidolia, where the human brain sees patterns in random data. There had to be a logical explanation. But the next morning before dawn, I heard it. The sound came from somewhere behind the station toward the woods. It was a vocalization, something between a roar and a howl, guttural and primal. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing, just absolute, pressing silence. I was out of bed before I realized I'd moved, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed my pistol from the drawer, though I barely remembered loading it. I stood in the darkness of my bedroom, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, not directly behind the station now, but somewhere to the side. Whatever was making it was moving. It was circling. The intelligent part of my brain tried to reason through it. A mountain lion. They don't exist in Pennsylvania, but maybe I was mistaken. They were native here once, before we killed them all. Maybe one had drifted back from the west. A mountain lion would explain the prints, explain the destroyed trees, explain the sound. But a mountain lion is a solitary predator. It wouldn't circle a human dwelling. It wouldn't vocalize like that. And mountain lions can't tear trees out of the ground with their bare strength. I stood in my bedroom, dressed in the clothes I'd slept in, holding a pistol I rarely fired. And I tried to stop shaking. The sound came again. This time it was unmistakably approaching. I could hear it moving through the undergrowth just beyond the tree line, less than 50 yards from the station. Something massive, something that couldn't move quietly because of its size, pushing through the forest with terrible, undeniable intent. I moved to the window. The darkness outside was absolute. The forest pressed right up to the edge of the clearing where my station sat. On clear nights, I could sometimes see stars reflected in the eyes of deer or raccoons. Tonight there was nothing but impenetrable blackness. The sound stopped. The waiting that followed was the worst part. Minutes passed. 3 minutes, 5, 10. I have no idea how long I stood at that window, pistol raised, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to emerge into the faint light cast by the single bulb above my station door. It never came. Whatever was out there, it had stopped coming toward me. Whether it had lost interest or realized I was inside the building, I don't know. But the forest went quiet again. The birds didn't return. The wind didn't pick up. There was just silence, and the slow realization that I was not alone in those mountains, and that the thing sharing them with me was not a species I had a name for. I didn't go back to bed. I sat at my kitchen table, the pistol in front of me, watching the darkness fade to gray as dawn approached. When the sun finally rose, I felt relief so intense it made me lightheaded. In the daylight, I could convince myself that I'd overreacted, misidentified sounds, let my imagination run away with me. Bears vocalize sometimes, so do big cats. The world still made sense in daylight, but I'd heard something that night that wasn't in any wildlife manual I'd ever read. And I knew, with a certainty that sat in my bones like cold, that it would come back. The next 3 weeks of my life were defined by waiting. I documented everything with obsessive detail, every unusual track I found, every sound I heard in the darkness, every piece of evidence that something was moving through the forest around my station. I created detailed maps, marked sighting locations, compiled data that proved, at least to myself, that I was not losing my mind. The creature was real. It was following a pattern. It seemed to be learning the layout of the human structures in its territory. On December 8th, I found more prints. These were closer to the station, just beyond the yard boundary. The thing had come even nearer while I slept, studying my dwelling. The prints were fresher than the others, pressed into soil that had only begun to freeze. I estimated they were less than 12 hours old. On December 12th, something tried the back door. I woke to the sound of the handle being tried, tested. The door was locked, had always been locked, but something outside was attempting to open it. I heard something lean against the door, heard the wood creak under pressure. I grabbed my pistol and rushed to the kitchen, ready to fire through the door if necessary. But whatever was out there, it stopped. After maybe 30 seconds of pressure, it withdrew. The sound of it moving away from the house was heavy, thunderous, the sound of something incredibly large retreating into the forest. I called the station supervisor the next morning. I reported what I'd heard. I tried to keep my voice steady and professional, but I could hear the strain in my own words. The response was the same dismissive pattern I'd received before. Likely a bear, possibly a large one in search of food before hibernation. The locked door prevented entry. Everything is fine, everything, but I couldn't convince anyone else of that, so I prepared. I reinvented my station. I secured the doors with additional locks. I installed motion sensor lights around the perimeter. I set up trail cameras to document what was happening when I slept. I stocked the larder with canned food and water. I began to prepare for something that I couldn't quite articulate, couldn't quite explain to anyone who might listen. And then on December 19th, something changed. The tracks stopped appearing. The vocalization ceased. For 4 days I heard nothing. The forest went quiet in a way that seemed almost normal. I told myself this was good. The creature had moved on to other territory. Winter was advancing, and perhaps it had gone further north, deeper into the wild lands where humans rarely ventured. But that relief was premature, because what came next wasn't the absence of the creature. What came next was something much worse. What came next was contact. The morning of December 23rd, I found something on my porch. I'd come outside to check the motion sensor equipment, to see if anything had triggered during the night, and I nearly stepped on it. It was a piece of an animal, a deer's leg, freshly severed, placed deliberately on my porch directly in front of the main door. The leg was still warm. The blood was still liquid. This had happened within the last few minutes, while I was inside the station, likely still in bed. I stood looking at that severed limb for a long time. There was no question about what this meant. It was a message, or a test, or perhaps a threat dressed up as a gift. Either way, the thing that had been studying my station had just made contact in the most direct way possible. I picked up the leg with a branch, placed it into a garbage bag and brought it inside. I sealed it in a smaller bag, then a larger bag, and placed it in the freezer. I still have photographs of it. I still keep those photographs for proof. And then I waited, because I knew that whatever had left that message intended to come back. This was not an ending, this was a beginning. The next 5 days until December 28th were the longest of my life. I didn't leave my station. I didn't even go outside except to check my motion sensors and water collection systems. The creature had made contact. It had demonstrated that it could approach my dwelling without me being able to stop it. The rules had changed. On the night of December 28th, everything escalated. I was asleep, or trying to be, when I heard the first sound. It started as a low vocalization, almost a rumbling, that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I was out of bed immediately, pistol in hand. For several seconds, I stood in the darkness of my bedroom, listening. Then I heard the second sound. And the third. There wasn't one creature out there. There were at least 3. The realization struck me in sequence, each one worse than the last. First, they could communicate with each other. Second, they were working together. Third, they had come in force. Whatever was about to happen, I was severely outmatched. The sounds grew louder. The vocalizations became more complex, almost musical in their coordination. They were calling back and forth, at least 3 distinct voices producing sounds no North American wildlife should be able to make. I moved through my station, checking doors and windows, pistol raised but feeling absurdly inadequate. They were surrounding the station. I could hear them moving in the dark, positioning themselves. They moved with purpose, with deliberation, as if they had planned this approach. The creature that had been studying my dwelling had brought others, and now they were closing in. I grabbed my satellite phone. I dialed the emergency number for the Park Service. A dispatcher answered on the second ring. I tried to explain what was happening, but my voice was shaking so badly that I could barely form words. Something in the forest. Multiple creatures, surrounding my station. The dispatcher's response was measured and calm. They would dispatch a ranger to investigate in the morning. Until then, I should remain inside with the doors locked. Was I in immediate danger? I told them I didn't know. I didn't know what these things were or what they wanted. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher told me to stay calm, keep the line open if I could, and help would arrive in the morning. The line went dead. The satellite phone had lost connection, probably due to the cloud cover or atmospheric interference. I was alone again, holding a dead phone, listening to the sounds of multiple large creatures moving around my station. And then they started hitting the walls. It wasn't frenzied or random. It was methodical. A heavy impact against the north wall, testing its integrity. Then a moment of silence. Then an impact against the east wall. Another pause. Then the south wall. They were systematically checking the structure, looking for weak points, looking for a way in. I moved to the windows, keeping away from the edges, and I tried to see what was out there. But the darkness was absolute, and whatever was out there, it had learned to avoid the motion sensor lights. Or perhaps there were more of them than I'd heard, some distracting the lights while others remained in shadow. The impacts continued. The walls shook under the force of whatever was hitting them. I estimated the force at several thousand pounds. The station structure was solid, built to last, but I began to wonder how long it would hold against a sustained assault from creatures of that power. Then one of them tried the door again. Not gently this time. The impact was brutal, testing the deadbolt I'd reinforced. The door frame cracked. I heard it clearly, the sound of wood splintering. I fired through the door. The pistol discharged, the sound enormous in the confined space of my station, and the recoil shocked me backward. There was a moment of absolute silence, then a scream that wasn't human. It was a sound that bypassed all my rational thought and went straight to my reptile brain. A sound of pain and rage that contained such pure violence that I had to fight the urge to vomit. The creature I'd shot had let out a scream that seemed to shake the very air around my station. The heavy impacts against the wall stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the assault, because now they knew I had a weapon. Now they knew I was willing to use it, and now, presumably, they were deciding what to do about that fact. I don't know how long I stood in the darkness of my station, pistol raised, waiting for the assault to resume. Minutes passed, perhaps as many as 10, and then I heard it, the sound of something large moving away from my dwelling back toward the forest, then another, and a third. They were leaving. I waited another 30 minutes before I let myself breathe normally. I turned on every light in my station. I locked every door and window that I hadn't already secured. And then I sat in my kitchen, still holding my pistol, and waited for dawn. The sun rose on December 29th to find me exactly where I'd been all night. Alive, safe, changed in a way I didn't yet understand. I opened the front door carefully and looked at the forest edge. There were no creatures visible. There were no sounds. There was just the quiet winter morning, snow beginning to fall. The world continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was going to happen again. The ranger who arrived at my station that morning was named Marcus. He was in his 60s, had been working the parks for longer than I had, and he approached my report with the kind of skepticism I'd come to expect. But when he saw the cracks in my doorframe, when he saw the damaged wood from the impacts, his expression shifted. "Bears do this?" I asked him. "Not like this," he said quietly. He was examining the damage with the careful attention of someone who'd seen a lot in the wilderness. "There's too much structural damage, too organized. A bear would break through, or it wouldn't. This is different." I showed him my documentation, the photographs of the prints, the measurements, the maps with the marked sighting locations, the video from my trail cameras, most of which showed nothing but darkness and movement too large to fully capture in the frame. He didn't argue with me. He asked to use my satellite phone to call back to headquarters. The conversation he had was not one-sided. He listened more than he spoke. When he hung up, he looked at me with something like pity. "They're sending a wildlife team," he said. "They'll be here tomorrow. They want you to remain in the station until they arrive. They don't want you to leave, and they don't want you to engage any wildlife. If you see something, you're supposed to stay inside and observe. No shots fired." "I shot one last night," I told him. "Something came through my door. It would have gotten inside." He was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you shoot it?" "Toward the door." "Through the door." "I don't know if I hit it or where. We should look around the station." We searched the perimeter, and Marcus was quiet and professional about it. We found evidence of blood, not far from the doorframe. Not a lot, just enough to confirm that my shot had connected. But there was no body. Whatever I'd shot, it had gotten away. "That's a problem," Marcus said. "An injured predator is a dangerous predator. And you said there were 3 of them? At least 3, maybe more. Then we have 3 potentially injured large predators in the forest, and none of them are where we can find them. He was thinking it through, working the problem like a puzzle. The wildlife team will need to know this. They'll need to come prepared. He stayed at my station that night. We took shifts, one of us sleeping while the other remained awake. The night passed quietly. Whatever was in the forest, it didn't come near my dwelling, but I could feel it out there. I could feel it watching. The wildlife team arrived the next morning in a convoy of 3 vehicles. There were 8 of them, all trained in wildlife management, all carrying tranquilizer rifles and heavy equipment. The lead was a woman named Dr. Rachel Chen, and her approach to the situation was immediately different from the Park Service's dismissive attitude. She read my documentation carefully. She examined the photographs. She studied the video from the trail cameras. She looked at the location markers on my maps. And when she was done, she looked at me with an intensity that made clear she believed what I was telling her. "I need to see the prints," she said. Marcus and I took her out to Raven Ridge. The walk there was tense. The team had fanned out, 2 of them staying close to us, the others sweeping the forest on either side. They were armed with tranquilizer rifles, but those seemed inadequate given what we were dealing with. When we reached the circle of destruction, Rachel went still. She approached the perimeter cautiously, like she was approaching a sleeping animal. She examined the fallen trees, the torn roots, the raw destruction of it all. She took photographs. She took samples. She measured distances and angles. "This is not a bear," she said finally. "This is not anything documented in our wildlife records." "Then what is it?" I asked. "I don't know yet." She was still studying the destruction, thinking something through. "But I intend to find out. Help me pack up this evidence. We're going to need to bring in specialists." Over the next week, Dr. Chen set up a research station near my dwelling. She installed more trail cameras, placed tracking sensors throughout the forest, set up audio recording equipment to capture any vocalizations. She was methodical, scientific, and clearly fascinated by what we might be dealing with. And then the creature attacked the research team. It happened on January 4th. One of Rachel's team members, a young field researcher named David, had wandered about a quarter mile from the research station to check on one of the audio sensors. He was alone, which turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. The attack was sudden and brutal. David ran back toward the research station screaming. The creature, a massive bipedal form that I finally got a clear view of, was chasing him. I saw it for maybe 3 seconds, a span of time that revealed in terrible detail that my measurements had been conservative. It was bigger than I'd estimated. Taller, broader through the shoulders, more musculature than seemed possible for a living animal. It was covered entirely in dark hair, which seemed to ripple as it moved. Its arms were nearly as long as its body, ending in hands with visible claws. The weapons I'd thought would be adequate looked suddenly pathetic. The research team opened fire with tranquilizer rifles, a fusillade of darts that hit the creature multiple times. The thing convulsed, thrashed, and suddenly changed direction. Instead of continuing to pursue David, it veered toward the research station and the people defending it. That's when I saw something that changed everything I understood about what we were dealing with. The creature didn't attack. It stopped, breathing heavily, regarding the armed humans with what looked like calculating intelligence. Then it withdrew, moving back into the forest with that heavy, thunderous gait. Within seconds, it was gone. David was brought back to the research station bleeding but alive. The creature had caught him across the back and shoulders with its claws, deep wounds that would leave permanent scars. He was treated for the injuries and evacuated via helicopter within the hour. Rachel was shaken, I could see it, but she was also exhilarated. "Did you see it?" she asked me. "Did you get a good look at it?" "Clear enough," I said. "It's massive, and it's intelligent." "Very intelligent," she agreed. It changed direction when the team started firing tranquilizers. It made a tactical decision. It recognized that we were a threat and chose to disengage rather than continue the attack. That's not animal behavior, that's thinking. The incident changed the approach. Rachel brought in more personnel, more equipment, and most importantly, a consultant from a private research organization I'd never heard of. His name was Dr. Adrian Reeves, and he arrived with the kind of equipment I'd never seen before. Thermal imaging cameras, advanced motion sensors, DNA analysis equipment. The first thing he did was pull Rachel aside and speak to her privately. I couldn't hear the conversation, but when he was done, Rachel looked at me with a new expression, something between concern and confusion. "Gavin," she said, "we need to discuss what you think is happening here." We sat in my station, Rachel, Marcus, and Adrian. Adrian pulled out a tablet and showed me images I'd never seen before. Photographs of footprints, photographs of forest damage similar to what I'd documented, footage from trail cameras, all of it from locations around North America. Oregon, Washington, California, Colorado, Minnesota, New York, the entire Appalachian region. These are all consistent with one creature or a very small population of creatures, Adrian said. All documented within the last 2 decades, all in remote wilderness areas, and all showing increasing intelligence and interaction with human populations. What are you saying? I asked. I'm saying this isn't new, Adrian replied. This isn't a first sighting of a species we didn't know existed. This is a species that has existed alongside human civilization for centuries, possibly longer, and it's been getting smarter. Marcus was quiet. Rachel was studying Adrian carefully. I felt like I was missing something crucial. There are reports of this creature dating back to the early European colonization of North America, Adrian continued. Native Americans had names for it. Different tribes, different names, but consistent descriptions. A large bipedal creature that lived in remote wilderness. That was intelligent enough to avoid humans. That was territorial and dangerous when provoked. Bigfoot, I said. It sounded stupid saying it out loud, like I was reverting to campfire mythology. That's one name, Adrian acknowledged. Others are more regional. But yes, some version of that concept has existed in human knowledge for a very long time. The scientific community has dismissed it as myth. But the evidence is getting harder to dismiss. He pulled up more photographs. These were older, grainy film footage from the 1960s, and then later footage, clearer, from trail cameras over the last decade. In all of them, the same basic form. Massive, bipedal, intelligent. What changed? I asked. If these things have existed for centuries, why are they becoming more aggressive now? Adrian looked troubled. We're encroaching on their territory. Our civilization keeps expanding further into the wilderness. Habitat destruction, climate change affecting their food sources. They're being pushed into smaller and smaller spaces, and they're learning that direct contact with humans can be advantageous in some cases. They've learned that we have food, shelter, tools. They've learned that we're not actually invulnerable. So what do we do? Rachel asked. Adrian was quiet. He looked at me and I could see calculation in his eyes. We catch one. We document it. We study it. We prove to the world that this species exists and is intelligent enough to deserve protection rather than execution. And if it kills someone in the process, Marcus asked quietly, then we have a much bigger problem, Adrian admitted. Because once humans start dying, the government will send in extermination teams. And what we're dealing with here is a species intelligent enough to plan coordinated attacks. A species that might be able to evade professional military-trained hunters. That could lead to a conflict that destabilizes everything we understand about our ecosystem. The conversation continued for another hour, but the essential idea was clear. Adrian wanted to capture one of the creatures. He wanted to study it, and he wanted to do it before the government realized what was actually happening and send in kill teams. I need your help, Adrian said to me. You know this territory better than anyone. You've been interacting with these creatures longer than anyone alive. If anyone can predict their behavior, it's you. I wasn't sure I could, but I agreed anyway. Because by that point, I wanted answers as badly as Adrian did. I wanted to know what had been studying my station, what had tried to force its way inside, what had survived a gunshot wound and kept coming back. The next phase of operations took on a military quality. Adrian's team set up a perimeter around my station and the surrounding forest. They placed cameras everywhere. They installed acoustic sensors that could detect the creature's vocalizations and triangulate their location. They used thermal imaging to search for the creatures at night. And they set traps, not physical traps, which would have been cruel and ineffective against creatures this intelligent. Instead, they used bait. They placed a freshly killed elk in a clearing, observed from hidden positions with cameras and tranquilizer teams standing by. They repeated this process multiple times over 2 weeks, and slowly the creatures grew curious. We documented them coming closer to the human structures. We documented them investigating the kills, feeding quickly and then retreating. We documented at least 5 distinct individuals, varying sizes and builds. The largest was probably close to 9 feet tall. The smallest was probably 7. They were a family group, or a pack, or some form of social unit anyway. The night of January 18th, we finally had our opportunity. A juvenile male, probably around 7.5 feet tall, approached the baited kill site alone. The older, larger males had been with the previous killings, But this juvenile came independently. It fed quickly, agitated, like it was doing something it shouldn't be doing. The tranquilizer team fired before it finished eating. 3 darts hit it simultaneously. The creature shrieked, a sound of surprise and pain, and bolted toward the forest. But the tranquilizers were fast-acting. Within 50 meters, its gait became unsteady. Within 100 meters, it was stumbling. The team moved in swiftly, carefully. Adrian had insisted on approaching the unconscious creature with extreme caution, and I understood why when I saw it up close. Even unconscious, it was terrifying. It was approximately 7 feet 8 inches tall. Its body was powerfully muscled, built for strength and endurance. Its hands, when I examined them carefully, had 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, with curved claws made of something that looked like keratin. Its feet were arched, clearly adapted for walking upright, and its face, partially hidden under a ridge of bone and a mat of hair, showed intelligence even in unconsciousness. "It's remarkable," Rachel breathed. "Look at the skeletal structure, the adaptations. This thing is evolutionarily adapted for bipedal locomotion. This isn't a mutation or a deformity. This is a distinct species." Adrian was running samples, blood, hair, skin cells. He was photographing every inch of the creature's body. He was measuring and documenting with the intensity of someone who knew he might never get another opportunity. "We need to move it," Adrian said finally. "Get it to the research station. We have sedatives that will keep it unconscious for up to 6 hours. We need to work fast." The creature was loaded onto a specially designed stretcher. A team of 8 people was required to carry it. The body temperature was elevated, about 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The muscle density was extraordinary. This was a creature that was strong enough to tear trees from the ground, and now it was unconscious on a stretcher in the snow-covered forest of Pennsylvania. Rachel walked next to me as we made our way back to the research station. "Are you okay?" she asked. I wasn't sure how to answer that. "I don't know what I am," I finally said. Back at the station, the creature was placed in a reinforced room that Adrian's team had been constructing for days. The walls were padded, the door was reinforced steel, and cameras monitored every angle. Adrian had thought through every contingency. The creature remained unconscious for another 3 hours, and then, slowly, it started to wake up. The process was gradual at first. Muscle movements, small shifts in position. Then its eyes opened, and I swear I saw intelligence flood into them. The creature was instantly awake, instantly aware. It surveyed its surroundings with rapid head movements, and I could see the moment it understood that it was trapped. A low vocalization emerged, not the aggressive roar I'd heard before, but something more measured, a call, perhaps, a summons. Adrian was in the observation room watching on camera, taking notes. "We'll keep it sedated for the first 48 hours, he said. "Let it adjust to captivity. Then we'll begin behavioral observations." But the creature didn't give us 48 hours. That night, around 2 a.m., the alarm went off. The creature had destroyed the camera in its enclosure. We rushed to the observation window to see what had happened. It had torn apart the padding on one wall, using pure strength. It was methodically working at the steel, looking for weaknesses. Its musculature seemed even more impressive now that I could see it moving with full power. Each movement was deliberate, testing, probing. It was problem-solving in real time. "It's going to get out," Marcus said quietly. "That door isn't going to hold it if it really wants through." Adrian was on his satellite phone, calling for backup. "We have a specimen that's escaping containment. We need a reinforced holding cell, something with steel bars, something that can't be beaten down, and we need it today." But we ran out of time before the cell arrived. The creature didn't batter the door down. Instead, it figured out that the hinges were the weak point. It methodically worked at the hinges, creating small fractures, working at them again and again. By the afternoon of the second day, the door was hanging by a thread. Adrian made the call to sedate it again. He didn't want to risk a confrontation in the confined space of the research station. But as the team approached with the sedative injection, the creature made a decision. It exploded into motion with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The creature launched itself at the team, and the door gave way. What followed was chaos. The team scattered, trying to get out of the creature's path. The injection team member fired the sedative, but the creature had already closed the distance. It hit her with what looked like almost casual force, and she flew backward, slamming into a wall. Adrian was shouting commands, trying to direct the team toward the exits. The creature didn't pursue them. Instead, it stood in the center of the research station, assessing the situation, making calculations, and then it left. It simply turned and walked toward the nearest exit, moving with purpose. No one tried to stop it. There was no way to stop it. The creature was outside before anyone could react. We heard it moving through the forest, that heavy thunderous gait, and within minutes it was gone. The team member who'd been hit was okay, damaged but functional. She had a cracked rib and some impressive bruising, but she'd live. But the point was undeniable now. Whatever we were dealing with, we couldn't contain it. We couldn't capture it, and we couldn't keep it prisoner. Adrian was devastated. Rachel was thoughtful. Marcus was already making calls to bring in federal authorities. The containment failed, Adrian said to no one in particular. The behavioral study is compromised. Everything we learned is now academic rather than practical. We won't get another chance. He was wrong about that. We were going to get another chance, but none of us knew it yet, and when it came it was going to be much worse. The creature didn't disappear back into the wilderness after its escape. Instead, it came back to my station that night. The entire research team was still present, bolstered by federal agents who'd arrived that afternoon. Everyone was on alert. When the alarm from the motion sensors went off, we all moved into prepared positions. The creature appeared at the forest edge, but it wasn't hostile. It was standing in clear view, on the edge of the clearing, with something in its hands. It was displaying something. Rachel rushed to the camera monitors. "Is that?" She trailed off. It was the juvenile's mother. We'd figure out later. She was injured, limping, clearly favoring her left leg. The massive male was holding her, supporting her, displaying her to us. "My God," Adrian whispered. "He came back for her." The male creature looked directly at the research station. Then, deliberately, it bent down and picked up a large rock. It hurled it at the station's wall with such force that it cracked the concrete. The message was clear. Rachel started toward the door. Adrian stopped her. "You can't go out there. He's injured and vulnerable," Rachel said. "If we can sedate them both, we can study." "No," Adrian interrupted. "That's not what this is. Look at him. Really look at him. He's not showing us vulnerability. He's showing us a threat. He's telling us that if we take her, he'll destroy this place and everyone in it. He's negotiating." The male dropped the mother carefully onto the ground and stood between her and our station, clearly ready to defend her. His body language was unmistakable. Attack us, and he would come through that door. Marcus stepped forward. "We stand down. We don't approach. We let them go. We're losing our only chance to study them," Adrian protested. "We're saving our lives," Marcus said, "and possibly theirs. That's intelligence we're looking at. That's emotion. That's something we don't have the right to destroy just because we want to understand it." In the end, that's what we did. We watched the massive male carefully help the injured female to her feet. We watched them walk back toward the forest, moving slowly because of her injury. We watched them disappear into the darkness, and we let them go. Adrian left Pennsylvania the next day, furious and defeated. The federal authorities concluded their investigation and decided the best course of action was to leave the creatures alone and mark the area as permanently off-limits to human habitation. The research station was dismantled. Rachel and her team packed up and left. Within a week, it was just Marcus and me again. The incident had lasted 45 days, and in that time the entire framework of what I understood about the world had been dismantled. That night, after everyone had left, I stood on my porch and looked out at the forest. I heard a vocalization in the distance, not aggressive, not threatening, just a call, perhaps a confirmation that the territory was secure again. I understood then that the creatures had won. They'd survived the capture attempt, they'd outsmarted us, and they'd made it clear that they would tolerate my presence as long as I didn't threaten them. We had come to an understanding. The remaining months of that winter were the strangest of my life. I continued in my role as a park ranger, though the scope of my duties had shifted dramatically. Park Service officials had made it clear that the area around my station was to be kept clear of hikers, campers, and tourists. Officially, it was due to dangerous wildlife. Unofficially, it was because we'd discovered something that the government wasn't quite sure how to classify or handle. I wasn't forbidden from leaving, but I chose to stay. I had unfinished business in those mountains. The creatures never came near my station again. The vocalizations that had marked the early winter faded. The prints stopped appearing near the buildings. But I knew they were still there, watching the boundaries of my territory as carefully as I was watching theirs. I began documenting their presence in a new way, not with the clinical detachment of a wildlife biologist, but with the careful attention of someone who'd come to respect what they were dealing with. I left food at carefully designated locations. I maintained these locations over weeks and months, and I began to see patterns in how they were using the territory. There were at least 6 of them, though I never saw all 6 together. The largest male was clearly the dominant individual. There were 2 other males, both subordinate, though I couldn't determine the exact hierarchy. There were 2 females, including the one who'd been injured, whose limp gradually improved over the following months. And there was a juvenile, the smallest of the group, probably less than 5 years old in human terms. They had a predictable range of movement through the territory. They had preferred sleeping areas, identifiable by the compressed vegetation and hair left behind. They had feeding sites where they hunted and processed prey. They were for all intents and purposes a family unit, and they had organized their territory with the complexity that spoke to genuine intelligence. By March, snow had melted in the lower elevations. The forest was starting to return to something approaching normal, though the vocalizations from the creatures suggested they were stressed. I began to understand why in April, when I found the den, I wasn't looking for it. I stumbled onto it while investigating a damaged section of trail along Raven Ridge. The entrance was well concealed, hidden behind a thick stand of hemlock and surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would provide multiple escape routes. It was the kind of location someone would choose if they wanted to raise offspring in safety. I didn't enter it. I maintained distance and used binoculars to observe the entrance. But I could see signs of occupation: old bones, shredded bark from stripped trees, the compressed ground of repeated traffic. Something was happening at the den. Activity was high, and the vocalizations were frequent. The creatures were agitated, though not in the aggressive way I'd heard before. This seemed more like concern, like something important was occurring. I reported this to Marcus on one of his monthly check-ins. He was still the point of contact between me and official Park Service business, though my reports were now much more carefully worded and vague. "The matriarch is probably denning," he said after I described the increased activity. "If these creatures reproduce, if the family structure is as complex as you're suggesting, then she would prepare a den for giving birth. That would explain the behavioral changes." "And then what?" I asked. "Then we have a new generation," Marcus said quietly. "More of these things. More intelligence spreading through the population. More potential for conflict with human settlements." But the birth, when it happened, wasn't something that caused me to feel concern. Instead, I felt something unexpected: hope. I first saw the juvenile in late April. It was tiny, no more than 3 feet tall, moving unsteadily beside the dominant female near one of the feeding sites. The mother was vigilant, keeping the newborn close, and the other family members were maintaining careful distance, giving her space. I watched through binoculars from a safe distance, and I found myself smiling. The creatures were expanding. They were creating offspring. They were securing a future for their kind in the remote mountains of Pennsylvania. And somehow, despite everything that had happened, despite the threat they represented, I was glad. The spring and early summer brought additional changes. The research community had largely moved on from the incident. Adrian had published several papers in specialized journals, carefully avoiding any claims that would damage his credibility in the mainstream scientific world. He'd framed everything in careful language about large unknown hominoid and potential undocumented primate. The papers were largely dismissed as fringe science. Rachel had taken a different approach. She'd transferred to a research position studying climate change impacts on wildlife behavior, effectively abandoning her pursuit of Bigfoot research. She'd left a note with Marcus for me, thanking me for my cooperation and suggesting that some mysteries were better left unsolved. By July, I'd settled into a new routine. I maintained my park ranger duties, but I also maintained my observation of the creatures. I'd created a detailed field notebook documenting behavior patterns, feeding habits, territorial range, and family dynamics. I took thousands of photographs. I recorded hundreds of hours of audio, and I became increasingly convinced of something that seemed impossible. The creatures had accepted my presence. They'd learned that I posed no threat. More than that, I'd started to believe that they understood my observations. They seemed to position themselves at times to be seen. They seemed to vocalize when they knew I was in the area, almost like a greeting. In August, I encountered the dominant female face to face. I was hiking the Raven Ridge Trail, conducting routine maintenance, when I rounded a bend and there she was. She was standing about 30 meters away, her newborn nearby, and she was watching me with clear, intelligent eyes. My first instinct was to reach for my pistol. My second instinct, stronger and more immediate, was not to. We stood looking at each other for a long moment. She was massive, probably 8.5 feet tall, her musculature rippling under her dark fur. She had a scar on her left shoulder, probably from the tranquilizer dart incident. She was, without question, the most dangerous thing I'd ever confronted. But her posture wasn't aggressive. She was standing still, watching me, making no move to advance or retreat. I slowly raised my hands, showing that they were empty, that I held no weapon. She made a low vocalization, almost a rumble. Then she turned and walked away, her juvenile following. She paused once, looked back at me, and made the vocalization again. It sounded almost like approval. After that encounter, the boundary between observer and observed became increasingly blurred. I would find food left at my station that I hadn't prepared. Freshly killed game animals, clearly placed deliberately on my porch. At first I thought it was an aggressive act, a threat. But then I realized they were leaving me a message of their own. We were allies of a sort. We had formed a treaty. By September, my understanding of the creatures had become almost anthropological. I believed they were using tools in simple ways, shaping branches to extract insects from trees, using stones to crack open nuts and roots. I believed they had language, whether verbal or some combination of vocalization and gesture that served communicative purposes. I believed they had social structures, hierarchies, family bonds, and possibly even concepts of morality and justice. They were not animals, not in any sense that would satisfy conventional biological classification. They were something between, something that bridged the gap between what we considered wildlife and what we considered civilization. In October, I finally made contact with Adrian directly. I called him on his cell phone, something I'd resisted doing for months. He answered on the second ring. "Gavin?" His voice expressed surprise and something like hope. "I wasn't sure I'd ever hear from you again. I want to share my data," I told him. "All of it. The observations from the past 6 months, the documentation, the behavioral analysis, everything, but not for publication, for a personal archive that exists outside of official channels." There was a pause. "You understand what you're describing? If you're right, if these creatures are as intelligent as you're suggesting—" "I know what I'm describing," I interrupted. "I'm describing a species that deserves protection, not study, not containment, protection. And I want there to be a record of that somewhere, in case something happens to me or to them." Adrian agreed. He sent me external hard drives, cloud storage access, equipment for backing up my data. Over the next month, I compiled everything. I created detailed narratives, high-resolution image files, audio recordings, metadata, analysis. I created a comprehensive documentary of a species that shouldn't exist and everything I'd learned about it. When I finished, Adrian made one request. "I need to come back," he said. "Not to study the creatures, not to interfere, but I need to see them. I need to know that they're real and that everything we experienced was genuine." I told him I would ask. I knew how that sounded, asking permission from an animal to introduce a human to it. But I also knew that if Adrian came without the creature's agreement, it could end badly. And I'd learned to trust their intelligence. I left a message at the main den site. Bones arranged in a pattern, markings on nearby trees, simple signs that Adrian would be coming, and that he would mean no harm. It felt foolish, believing that they could understand a message this abstract. But by that point, very little seemed foolish anymore. Adrian arrived on a cold November afternoon, just as the leaves were turning. He had aged since January, his hair grayer, his face lined with new stress. But his eyes lit up when he saw me. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," I replied. I took him hiking along the Raven Ridge Trail. I showed him the den site, maintained at careful distance. I showed him the feeding areas. I showed him the trees where the creatures had marked territory with claw scratches. I showed him the world they'd built in the remotest sections of the Appalachian mountains, and then, as if summoned by our presence, they appeared. The entire family group emerged from the forest. The dominant male first, then the females and juveniles behind him. They stood at the edge of a clearing, perhaps 50 meters away, and they watched us. Adrian froze. "There are 6 of them, just as you documented." "7 now," I corrected. "The newborn makes 7. There might be another one born next year. The creatures made no move toward us. They simply stood there observing Adrian with the same careful attention he was giving them. The newborn juvenile huddled close to its mother, clearly curious about the new human. "They're letting us watch them," Adrian breathed. "They're deciding about you," I said. "Whether you're a threat, whether you're trustworthy." The dominant male made a long vocalization, a sound that started low in his chest and rose to a pitch that seemed almost musical. The other creatures responded with quieter vocalizations, and then, slowly, they turned and walked back toward the forest. But the dominant male paused. He looked directly at Adrian, and I swear that in that moment, some communication passed between them, an understanding. Then he was gone, and the creatures disappeared back into the trees. Adrian stood in silence for a long time. "I need to sit down," he said finally. We found a fallen log and sat on it, looking out at the forest where the creatures had vanished. "What now?" Adrian asked. "Now we protect them," I said. "You, me, Rachel if she'll participate, maybe Marcus. We become the keepers of their secret. We make sure the world doesn't find out about them until they're ready, or until we're dead. And if the world finds out anyway, then we'll have done what we could," I said. "Which is more than they deserve, probably. More than most species get." Adrian nodded slowly. "I'll help. I'll maintain the archive. I'll add my own research. I'll make sure there's a record that someday someone will find." We walked back to my station as the sun set. The forest was quiet except for the normal sounds of wildlife. The creatures were out there, living their lives, raising their young, existing in a space between myth and reality that we'd somehow stumbled into. The winter of 2021 to 2022 was the last one I spent as a park ranger in Pennsylvania. I submitted my resignation in January, citing personal reasons. The Park Service didn't argue. They were happy to be rid of the complicated situation I represented. They transferred Marcus back to a normal post, and eventually my station was closed. I could have left the territory entirely. I could have moved away, found a job elsewhere, tried to forget what I'd seen. But I didn't want to. Instead, I bought land adjacent to the protected area, private land that wasn't patrolled by park officials, land where I could maintain my observations without official oversight. I built a small cabin there, nothing fancy, just something functional enough to live in while I continued documenting the creature's existence. Adrian helped me set up remote camera systems. Rachel, when I finally convinced her to visit in the spring of 2022, helped me develop a more sophisticated behavioral taxonomy. We created a private research network, sharing data between us, maintaining the archive that would someday, we hoped, prove the creature's existence to a skeptical scientific community. But the more important work was the protection. We used our connections and resources to ensure that the protected area remained protected. We funded conservation efforts that would maintain habitat. We monitored news sources for any rumors of sightings that might lead to a hunting expedition. We became, without ever officially organizing it, the creature's advocates. The family group grew and thrived. By the winter of 2023, there were at least 9 of them, accounting for the newborns that had appeared that autumn. I believed I could identify each one by sight now, could predict their movements, could understand their patterns, and most importantly, I had evidence that they knew me. They recognized my presence. They anticipated my observations. One winter night in January 2024, I was sitting on the porch of my cabin when the dominant male appeared at the forest edge. He was carrying something and he walked directly toward my cabin with a purpose that was unmistakable. He placed the object on my porch, approximately 3 feet from where I sat. It was a perfectly intact arrowhead, worked stone, ancient. He made a low vocalization, something that sounded almost like gratitude or perhaps a blessing. Then he turned and walked back to the forest, disappearing into the darkness. I picked up the arrowhead with shaking hands. It was beautiful, expertly crafted. Something that a human artisan had created hundreds or thousands of years ago. The creature had found it in the forest and brought it to me. It was a statement of alliance, a gift that bridged species and time, a symbol that we had somehow moved beyond predator and prey, observer and observed, into something new. I keep that arrowhead on my desk still. I hold it sometimes when I'm writing, trying to put into words something that defies language. The creatures are still there, as far as I know. My observations continue, though I've learned to maintain a greater distance, to intrude less. They have their lives to live, and I've learned that the best protection I can offer is to let them exist in peace. But I know they're there. I see the signs. I hear the vocalizations when the wind blows right. I find the gifts they leave sometimes, placed carefully where I'll find them. We have formed a treaty of sorts, the creatures and I, an understanding that benefits both of us. They get protection from someone who understands what they are. I get to bear witness to something miraculous, and somewhere, in hard drives and cloud storage and carefully maintained archives, the proof exists. Not the proof that will convince the skeptics because they don't want to be convinced, but the proof that will exist someday, when these creatures finally reveal themselves, when the time is right. For now, they wait. And so do I. We wait together in the mountains, guardians of a secret that the world isn't ready to know. And every night, when I hear that distant vocalization from the forest, I know that I've done the right thing, that somewhere in the complexity of our relationship with nature there is still room for respect, for distance, for mystery. The creatures remain, and I will remain their keeper, their observer, their ally, for as long as I live. 3 years have passed since that night when the dominant male left me the arrowhead. I'm writing this now in December 2024, knowing that I need to set down the complete record before something happens that prevents me from doing so. I'm not sick. I haven't been given any terminal diagnosis, but I've come to understand that there are forces in motion, decisions being made at levels I'm not party to, that could fundamentally change the situation in these mountains. The winter of 2024 has been one of intense study and observation. Adrian, Rachel, and I have expanded the archive to include comprehensive behavioral documentation, genetic material analysis done with extreme care and minimal intrusion, and detailed sociological observations. We've come to believe that we understand, at least in broad outline, what these creatures are. They are not Homo sapiens, but they're not entirely separate from our evolutionary line either. Adrian believes they represent a branch of human evolution that took a different path, probably hundreds of thousands of years ago. Rather than developing technology and civilization, they developed intelligence, social complexity, and an intimate understanding of their environment. They became the perfect wilderness creatures, intelligent enough to solve problems, social enough to form family units, wild enough to remain part of nature rather than attempting to dominate it. Rachel has theorized that they represent what humans could have been if we'd chosen differently, if we'd valued survival and family over conquest and expansion, if we'd seen ourselves as part of nature rather than separate from it. I don't know if either of them is right, but I know that they're intelligent, they're self-aware, and they deserve existence without persecution. That's become increasingly threatened this year. In March 2024, I became aware of a problem. Adrian received a communication from a researcher he'd once collaborated with at a major university. This researcher had obtained some of the hair samples Adrian had collected 3 years ago during the initial capture attempt, hair samples that Adrian thought had been destroyed or properly archived away. The researcher had run them through modern genetic analysis and found something remarkable. The DNA was hominid but distinct, divergent enough to represent a separate species but close enough to be clearly related to Homo sapiens. He was planning to publish a paper announcing the discovery. Adrian called emergency meetings with Rachel and myself. We understood the implications immediately. Publication would mean media attention. Media attention would mean government interest. Government interest would mean scientific expeditions, potentially followed by military interventions, possibly followed by extermination campaigns. Adrian attempted to prevent publication. He contacted the researcher directly, explained the situation, asked him to sit on the data. The researcher refused. He believed this was a historic scientific discovery that belonged in the public record. Nothing Adrian could say would dissuade him. So Adrian did something I'm still not entirely comfortable with, even now. He discredited the research. He contacted other academics, questioned the validity of the analysis, suggested that the samples might have been contaminated or misidentified. He threw enough scientific weight behind his objections that the journal the researcher was submitting to decided to commission a detailed peer review before considering publication. That bought us time. Maybe 2 years, maybe 5, depending on how thoroughly the review was conducted. But it also meant that someone in the scientific community now knew that something unusual was out there. And someone in government, reading summaries of this peer review, might start asking questions. We're running out of time, Adrian said during one of our video conferences. Whether we like it or not, these creatures can't stay secret forever. Eventually someone else will find evidence. Eventually someone will believe. And when that happens, we need to have a plan. What kind of plan? Rachel asked. The kind that ensures their survival, Adrian replied. Because once the government gets involved, everything changes. These creatures will become a matter of national security, scientific interest, environmental policy. They'll become a debate, and in that debate, they'll be treated as objects of study rather than sentient beings with rights. I've spent months thinking about what Adrian said, and I've come to realize that I need to tell this story. I need to tell it in a way that creates a context for the creatures before the science community tells it in a way that creates a context for exploitation. The creatures themselves have continued their lives in the mountains, unaware of the political and scientific machinations happening beyond their territory. Or perhaps they're aware. Perhaps they understand that their existence is threatened in ways that go beyond physical danger. In September of this year, I observed something that suggested they might understand. I was monitoring a remote camera near the den site when I captured footage of the entire family group gathered together. This was unusual. They typically only gathered like this for specific purposes: cooperative hunting, defense of territory, or significant family moments. In this footage, they remained gathered for nearly 2 hours, and they spent the entire time vocalizing, not their normal vocalizations, but something different, something that sounded almost musical, almost ritualistic. Rachel watched the footage multiple times. "I think they're teaching," she finally said. "I think they're transmitting knowledge. Look at the smaller ones. They're not participating. They're listening, learning." Adrian agreed. If they have language, if they transmit knowledge through cultural practice, then they're not just intelligent, they're a civilization. It was the word that finally crystallized what we'd all been thinking but not quite articulating. They weren't animals with unusual intelligence. They were a civilization, a culture, a society with traditions, knowledge, and presumably moral frameworks of their own. And we were watching them operate within that society, following rules and practices that we were barely beginning to understand. Over the next months, I focused my observations on documenting this cultural transmission, the teaching moments, the times when older individuals demonstrated to younger ones how to process certain foods, how to navigate territory, how to respond to threats, the vocalizations that seem to carry specific meanings. I created what I'm calling a linguistic database. Each vocalization is noted with context, frequency, response. I'm not close to cracking whatever language they use, but I have strong suspicions about certain patterns. The rising vocalization that comes before hunting expeditions is clearly a summons or command. The complex harmonic sound they make when new juveniles are introduced to the family seems to be a welcoming or acknowledgement. The low, rumbling vibration that sounds almost subvocal is definitely a warning or territorial assertion. And there's one sound I've only heard the largest male make, a complex series of tones that seems to be something like a formal statement. Adrian suggested it might be something equivalent to a name or a formal proclamation of status. The more I study their behavior, the more impossible it becomes to deny their sentience. They are people, not people in the way humans are people, but people in the sense that they have culture, language, family structures, and what appears to be law. This brings us back to the central question that we keep dancing around but never quite addressing directly. What is our obligation to them? Adrian believes we have an obligation to preserve them as a species. He's working behind the scenes to ensure that the protected area remains protected, that Park Service policies continue to discourage human incursion, that the creatures are given space to exist. Rachel believes we have an obligation to eventually facilitate their introduction to the human world. Not immediately, but eventually. She believes that a species this intelligent shouldn't remain hidden forever, and that the proper time might come when they could interface with human society in a way that was beneficial to both. I'm not sure either of them is right, but I'm certain we have an obligation to do something. In October, I received a visit that changed everything. A woman came to my cabin, someone I'd never seen before. She was in her 60s, professional in bearing, with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of authority. She identified herself as Dr. Helen Matheson from the Department of Interior, and she was here to inform me that my presence in the protected area had been noted and documented, and that she had some questions about my activities. I could have denied everything. I could have claimed I was simply maintaining my land, living quietly, observing nature as any wildlife enthusiast might. Instead, I told her the truth. I took her into my cabin and I showed her everything. The field notebooks, the photographs, the recordings, the genetic data that Adrian had collected and sent to me. Everything. She listened without interrupting, examining the materials with the careful attention of someone trained in analysis. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're aware that this is a federal matter," she finally said. "I am." "You're aware that withholding information about the existence of an unknown species is a violation of federal law?" "I am." "And yet you did it anyway." "Yes," I said, "because I believe the creatures deserve protection, not exploitation." Dr. Matheson smiled. It was a strange moment. Here was a government official, someone who represented the system that most threatened these creatures, and she was smiling. "Mr. Gavin," she said, "I want to tell you something that very few people know. Your creatures are not new information to the federal government. We have known of their existence since at least 1975. We have extensive records, we have protocols, and we have, as of 2019, established a formal protection order for this region." I wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. "You've known?" "Of course we've known," she said. "The Native American tribes have always known. The indigenous population's oral traditions reference these creatures extensively. When we began taking their concerns seriously, we started investigating. And we found what you found: a species, a civilization, a people. Then why haven't they been protected? Why haven't they been formally recognized?" "Because," Dr. Matheson said carefully, "we've determined that formal recognition would lead to their destruction. The moment these creatures are officially documented as a known species, they become subject to scientific study, environmental impact assessment, and 1,000 other processes that would require them to be treated as objects rather than subjects. The moment they're recognized as intelligent beings with rights, they become subjects of political debate about their status and their place in human society. And the moment they're recognized as a threat to human interests, there will be calls for their elimination." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the forest where the creatures lived. "So we protect them through secrecy," she continued. "The protected area remains protected because it's classified as sensitive ecosystem habitat. The Park Service discourages human presence through bureaucratic means. And people like you, researchers like Adrian and Rachel, you serve as informal monitors and advocates within your own networks." "And when the research inevitably surfaces?" I asked. "When someone publishes proof of their existence?" "We've developed plans for that contingency," Dr. Matheson said. "We have prepared statements that reframe any such evidence as hoaxes or misidentifications. We have relationships with media organizations that will help us discredit inconvenient discoveries. And if absolutely necessary, we have legal mechanisms to suppress publication of research that threatens national security." "And you think that's ethical?" I asked. "I think ethics are more complicated than they appear," she replied. "I think preserving a species through necessary deception is ethically superior to letting them be destroyed through the truth. And I think you agree with me, or you wouldn't have done what you've done." She was right, and that knowledge sat uncomfortably with me. Dr. Matheson left my cabin with copies of my data. She told me that her department would add my observations to their records. She told me that my work was valuable, and that I should continue it. She told me that everything would remain classified unless circumstances changed dramatically. And she told me something else that I've been thinking about ever since. "These creatures," she said, "represent something important. They represent the possibility that intelligent life can exist on this planet without destroying everything around them. They represent a path not taken by humans, and they prove that that path was possible. In a time when humanity is struggling with the ecological consequences of our own choices, they're a reminder that it didn't have to be this way." She paused at the door. "Protect them," she said. "Not just from hunters and researchers, but from the knowledge that the world wants to exploit them. Let them live as they've lived for millennia. That's the greatest gift we can give them." After she left, I sat in my cabin for a long time, trying to process what I'd learned. The government knew, they'd known for decades, and they'd made a deliberate choice to keep it secret, a choice that I'd independently made myself. I called Adrian and Rachel that evening and told them about the visit. Adrian was not surprised. He'd suspected for years that the government must know that the protection of the area was too convenient, too complete to be coincidental. Rachel was disturbed, concerned about the implications of government secrecy, but both of them agreed with Dr. Matheson's conclusion. The creature's best chance for survival was continued secrecy. That night I walked to my favorite observation point and waited for the creatures to appear. They always do, around dusk, moving through the forest to one of their feeding sites. Tonight was no exception. The family group passed within 30 meters of where I sat, their presence acknowledged with a simple pause and a low vocalization from the dominant female. She recognized me. We had been doing this for nearly 4 years now, and she knew my scent, my presence, my non-threatening nature. I watched them move through the forest with their characteristic power and grace. The newborn juvenile, now nearly 4 feet tall and fully integrated into family movements. The adolescents, learning the skills they would need as adults. The adults, maintaining the territory, teaching the young, building and maintaining a society that existed in the margins of a human-dominated world. They were beautiful, they were intelligent, and they deserved to exist in peace. The winter of 2024 is drawing to a close. Spring will come soon. New juveniles will probably be born. The creatures will continue their lives in the mountains, unaware of the political structures that are protecting them, unaware of the governments and researchers who know their secrets. I will continue my observations. I will continue to document their existence. I will continue to be their advocate within human systems. And if the time ever comes when they're discovered, when their existence can no longer be kept secret, I will do everything in my power to ensure that they're treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. They are not animals, they are people. Different from us, certainly. Built for a different world, following different values, organized around different principles. But they are people nonetheless. And that's what I want to be remembered for, when this story finally breaks and the world learns the truth about the Appalachian Mountains. Not for the sensational discovery, not for being the first to document an unknown species, but for recognizing, early on, that what I was dealing with was not something to be studied and exploited, but something to be protected and respected. The creatures remain as they have remained for millennia. They will continue to remain in these mountains, in these forests, living their lives according to their own laws and their own understanding of the world. And I will remain here too, keeping watch, keeping records, keeping their secret. This is the true account of my encounters with something that shouldn't exist, but does. This is the story of the park keeper and the creatures he learned to call people. And this is my promise, that as long as I live, I will protect them with everything I have. Not because it's my duty, but because it's the right thing to do. People always ask me why a man takes a job that nobody else wants. I usually give them the easy answer. I tell them about the pay, about the benefits, about the way the National Park Service looks good on a resume. They nod and they let it go, because the easy answer is the kind of thing you can chew without choking on it. The real answer is harder. The real answer is that I came back from my second tour and I could not stand the noise of cities anymore. I could not stand the smell of asphalt baking in summer, or the way men crowd you on a sidewalk without ever once looking at your face. My grandfather worked the forests up in the Flathead country before he died, and my mother grew up with the Salish on the western side of the divide. Grey Wolf is the name on my driver's license, but the name my grandfather used to call me was Ralph, after the white shoulder of the mountain you can see from his porch on a clear morning. He believed names had weight. He believed that if you carried the right one, the country would recognize you when you walked into it. I did not believe him then. I am 34 years old now, and I am beginning to. Bowman Lake sits in the far northwest corner of Glacier National Park, 20 miles up a washboard dirt road that floods every spring and grows potholes the size of pickup trucks. The ranger station near the foot of the lake is a small wooden building with a tin stovepipe and a porch. And a quarter mile up the eastern shore there is an older patrol cabin used by the backcountry crew during the busy months. The cabin was built in 1932 by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It is one room and a loft and a wood stove. It has a single propane lantern, a bunk, a writing desk, and a window that looks out across the water at the mountains on the far side. The roof leaks above the desk. The floor has been worn smooth by 80 years of boots. I asked specifically for that cabin. That is important to remember. My supervisor, a woman named Renata Bird Rattler, who runs dispatch out of the West Glacier office, told me I was crazy to want it. She told me the men who worked it usually rotated out after one season. Not because of the bears, she said. Not because of the cold. They rotated out, she said, because of the way the lake gets inside your head. She laughed when she said that, but it was the kind of laugh a woman uses when she is telling you something she does not want to be responsible for. I told her I had spent a year and a half listening to my own thoughts in a striker outside Mosul. I told her a quiet lake was not going to hurt me. She signed the paperwork and gave me the key, and she did not laugh again. I drove up at the end of May, the back of my truck loaded with food and books, and the radio gear, and a 40-pound bag of dog food. The dog was a brindlehound named Beaumont I had picked up from a shelter in Kalispell 2 weeks before. He sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window the whole way up the road, his eyes half closed against the wind, his nose tasting the air. He was the only living thing I had spoken to in 3 weeks. I figured that was a fine ratio. The drive-in is slow. You leave Polebridge with its red mercantile and its huckleberry bear claws, you cross the river on a one-lane bridge, and you climb. The forest closes around you. The road narrows. Lodgepole pines and Engelmann spruce stand shoulder to shoulder along the shoulder of the road, and in places they grow so close that the branches knit overhead and the light turns green, like driving through the bottom of a deep pool. There were no other cars on the road that afternoon. There rarely are. By the time I reached the lake, I had not seen another human face for 40 miles. The patrol cabin smelled of mouse droppings and old wood smoke. I spent that first afternoon airing it out and stocking the pantry and walking the perimeter with Beaumont, listening for things a man who has spent time in dangerous places listens for: snapping twigs that come at intervals, quiet that lasts too long, birds going up out of a tree line all at once. I heard nothing of that kind. The lake was glass that day. Across the water, Rainbow Peak and Rudder Peak rose in their clean blue silhouettes. A loon was calling somewhere to the north. The wind came off the snow on the high country, and it had the smell of wet stone and sap. I will say plainly that for the first 10 days I was happy. I want to be honest about that. I want anyone reading this to understand that I did not arrive at Bowman already broken. I slept well in the cabin. I ran my routes in the morning. I logged my radio checks at the proper hours. I cleaned the fire pit at the small campground at the foot of the lake, and I greeted the few backpackers who came through, and I was polite, and I gave them the maps they needed, and I told them what to do if a grizzly came into their sight. Bowman sat at my feet by the wood stove in the evenings while I read. The light off the water in the long northern dusks was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I wrote a letter to my mother. I wrote a letter to my old platoon sergeant. I told them both that I had finally found a place where my hands stopped shaking. The first time I heard the voice was on the 11th night. I was washing dishes in the metal basin on the porch. The lake was very still. The sun had gone behind the western ridge maybe 40 minutes earlier, and there was that long blue hour you get up there in summer, where the sky is bright, but the trees are dark, and the water holds the last of the light like a held breath. I had the cabin window open behind me. Beaumont was lying on the boards at my feet. A man's voice came across the water. It said, "Hello?" Then it said, "Hello? Is somebody there?" It was not a loud voice. It was the kind of voice a tired hiker uses when he has been walking longer than he meant to, and he sees a light in the trees and he wants to be sure he is not about to walk into a stranger's camp. It was a polite voice. It had the cadence of a real human being. It had a slight rasp in it as though the throat had been talking all day. I dried my hands on my pants and I went to the porch rail. Beaumont sat up. His ears went forward. He was watching the lake. The voice said, "Hello, my friend got hurt." The voice said, "Can you help us?" There was a pause. The water did not lap the dock. The loon had stopped calling. From my porch I could see the entire eastern shore of the lake clear down to the boat dock and the campground beyond it. There was no one there. There was no flashlight. There was no movement on the trail that ran through the trees. The voice had come from somewhere out on the water, or from the far side of it. The far side of Bowman Lake at that point is 2.5 miles across. A man's voice at conversational volume does not carry 2.5 miles. Beaumont made a low sound in his throat. It was not a bark. It was the sound a dog makes when something on the other side of a door has gotten his attention. I put my hand on his collar. The voice came again. "Hello, please, we need help." I stood there with my hand on the dog and I did not answer. I do not know why I did not answer. Some old instinct from a long time ago in a country very far from Montana, I think. The same instinct that used to tell me not to walk down the wide street when I could walk down the narrow one. The instinct that used to tell me when a smile in a shop window did not belong to a friendly man. The voice said, "Please." Then it stopped. Beaumont stayed pointed at the water for a long time. That was the first night I locked the cabin door. In the morning the lake was the color of pewter and there was a fog hanging on the surface so thick you could not see the dock from the cabin steps. I made coffee and I sat on the porch with my hands wrapped around the mug and I thought about what I had heard. I had been in the woods of one country or another for most of my adult life. I had done one tour in Iraq and one in Afghanistan, and I had worked summers as a wilderness guide in the Bob Marshall before I joined the Park Service. I knew what voices sounded like in the woods. I knew that water carries sound oddly. I knew that on a still night a conversation from across a lake can come to you as if it is being spoken at your elbow, and I knew the opposite, that a man shouting from 50 yards away in heavy timber can be inaudible. I had heard 100 strange noises in 100 strange places, and I had given each one a name and put it in its proper drawer. I could not put what I heard the night before in any drawer. I called dispatch at 0700. Renata answered. I told her what had happened. I kept my voice level. I gave her the time and the conditions and the direction. I told her the wording of what the voice had said. She was quiet for a moment. She asked me if I had filed an incident report. I said I would file one if she needed me to. I said I had not yet made up my mind whether the voice had been a real person. She asked me what else it could have been. I did not have an answer for her. I told her I would walk the eastern shore that morning, and I would check the campground at the head of the lake, and I would radio her when I had finished. She told me to be careful. She said it the way she said it to me when I started, which is the way a woman who is not your mother will sometimes say it, with a small extra note in it that means something more than the words on their own. I took Beaumont and I walked the eastern shore of the lake. You have to understand the shape of Bowman Lake to understand what I am about to tell you. The lake runs roughly from southeast to northwest. It is 7 miles long and it is narrow, less than a mile wide in most places. The trail follows the eastern shore the entire length of it. The first 3 miles are easy walking through old-growth larch and spruce. After that the trail climbs a little, and the forest thickens, and the campsites become more spread out, and you stop seeing day hikers because day hikers do not generally walk 7 miles in and 7 miles out. By the time you reach the head of the lake you are deep in the country and you have not seen a road for a long time. I did the whole length that day, 14 miles round trip. I checked every campsite. 3 of them were occupied. A father and son out of Bozeman at the 3rd site. A pair of women in their 50s at the 5th site. School teachers from Missoula on a trip they had been planning for 2 years. A solo backpacker named Roy Delaney at the 7th site, the farthest one in. He was a man around my age with a sunburn across the bridge of his nose and a copy of a Cormac McCarthy novel folded into the side pocket of his pack. I asked each of them whether they had walked back toward the foot of the lake the previous evening. None of them had. The father and son had been at their campsite from 4 in the afternoon onward. The school teachers had been making dinner. Roy Delaney had been swimming. He showed me his wet socks drying on a line as proof, and he laughed about how cold the water still was in late May. I asked each of them whether they had heard anything unusual. The teachers said they had not. The father said he had thought he heard somebody calling his son's name in the woods around dusk, but he had decided he had imagined it. He said his son was right next to him at the time. He said it casually, the way a man tells a story that has not yet bothered him. His son was 14. He was sitting on a log eating a granola bar while we talked. He looked up at his father and he said, "Dad, I heard it too." He said, "I thought you were calling me from the bear box." The father went quiet. He had not known his son had heard it. I made a note in my field book. I did not say anything to alarm them. I told them to keep their food properly stored and to stay close to camp at night, and I gave them the radio frequency for the ranger station. I walked back south along the shore. The fog had burned off by then, and the lake was that hard cold blue you get in glacier country, and the surface was perfectly still, and I could see all the way down to the rocks 20 feet below the trail when I crossed the inlet streams. About a mile from the cabin I found something. It was on the trail itself, in a stretch where the soil is fine and damp and holds a print well. It was a single bare footprint. It was a man's print, maybe a size 11. The toes splayed wide the way the toes of a person who has gone barefoot all his life splay. The arch was deep. The heel was sharp. There was no left or right print to match it. There was only the one, planted square in the middle of the trail facing toward the cabin, and around it the duff was undisturbed, as if a man had stepped down out of the air onto that one spot and gone no further. Beaumont would not walk past it. I had to lift him and carry him over. I photographed the print with my phone. I measured it against my own boot. I walked a circle of 50 yards around it and found nothing. No companion print, no drag marks, no sign that a person had crouched there or sat there or done anything human there. I called Renata when I got back to the cabin and I told her about the print. I tried to keep my voice neutral. I succeeded, mostly. I heard her shuffle some papers on her end. I heard her sigh. She said, "Ralph, I want you to listen to me for a minute." She said, "The men who worked that cabin before you, the ones who left after one season, most of them, when they came down out of there, they wrote in their reports about hearing voices. They wrote about hearing voices of people they knew. They wrote about hearing voices of people who were dead. The Park Service does not put that information in the briefing because we do not want to put ideas in your heads. We want each ranger to come at it fresh." I asked her why. She said, "Because if you tell a man to expect something, he will hear it whether or not it is there." I said, "But if it is there?" She did not answer that. I asked her what those men reported finding. She said nothing. Most of them did not find anything. They just stopped sleeping. They started losing weight. They put in transfer requests. A couple of them quit the service entirely. I asked her about the ones who did find something. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Ralph, I am not the right person to tell you about that. There is a man named Vincent Two Hawk who used to work that cabin in the 80s. He lives in Browning now. If you want to call him tonight, I will give you his number. He will tell you what he wants you to know." I took down the number. I thanked her. I hung up the radio. I did not call him that night. I should have. I want anyone reading this to understand that I had a chance to know more, and I did not take it, because some part of me was still trying to be the kind of man who solves problems on his own. That was the second night. That was the night the voice came back. It started a little after midnight. I had been asleep maybe 2 hours. The cabin was warm. I had banked the wood stove down for the night, and the embers gave off that soft red light that finds the pine knots in the floorboards and makes them glow. Belmont was on the rag rug at the foot of the bunk. He had been restless when we lay down, but he had finally settled, his belly rising and falling slow, his nose tucked under his front paw. The voice that woke me was a child's voice. It was outside the cabin window, in the trees behind the woodshed. It said, "Please, mister." It said, "Please, my dad fell down." I was awake the way you are awake after a year and a half of being shot at. Not gradually, all at once. I lay there in the bunk and I did not move and I did not breathe and I listened. The voice said, "Please." It said, "Our truck is on the road." It said, "My dad cannot get up." There were no children at Bowman Lake. I knew this because I had walked the entire length of the trail 12 hours earlier and I had spoken to every party and every campsite. There were no children at the head of the lake and no children at the foot. The road to Bowman closes at sundown to vehicle traffic per park policy, although the regulation is more honored in the breach than the observance, and there was no truck on the road I would have heard come up. The road grades come up past the cabin. You hear engines at Bowman from a long way off. I rolled over slowly and I picked up my service belt from the chair beside the bunk. I clipped the radio to it. I put the sidearm in the holster. I left the boots off, because boots make sound on a wood floor, and I went to the window in my socks. The window faces north toward the woodshed. Beyond the shed there is 15 yards of open ground, and then the wall of the forest. The moon was a quarter full and the sky was clear, and the open ground showed in that thin bone-colored light. But the shed itself threw a black wedge of shadow that swallowed everything behind it. The voice was inside that shadow. "Please, mister," the voice said. "Please." I cannot explain what happens to a man's mind in that moment. I had heard voices like that before. I had heard them in Hellland, where the children would come to the wire and the children were sometimes children and sometimes they were not. Sometimes they had been sent. Sometimes they had something strapped to them. Sometimes they were just hungry. You learn to listen for the wrong note in a child's voice. You learn that a child in real distress does not actually sound like the children in movies. A child in real distress has a hitching breath. The voice cracks. The vowels come out wrong because the throat is closed up with crying. The voice in the shadow of the woodshed had no wrong note. It had no hitch. It was perfect. It was the voice of an actor who has been told to play a child in distress and who is doing a fine, polished, practiced job of it. The voice said, Mister, my dad is going to die." Beaumont was standing at my heel. He was not growling. He was making the same low sound he had made on the porch 2 nights earlier, that under-the-throat noise that is older than barking. His tail was tucked. I did not open the window. I did not open the door. I took my radio off the belt. I keyed it. I said, "Dispatch, this is Bowman Patrol Cabin, copy." The radio was silent for perhaps 4 seconds. Then Renata came on. She sounded fully awake. She had been awake for the previous transmission too, I think, although I did not know it at the time. She had been waiting up for me. I said, "Dispatch, I have a possible juvenile in distress reporting an injured adult somewhere on the road. I said it the way I had been trained to say it. I gave her my coordinates. I told her there was no truck on the road that I had heard arrive. She said, "Ralph, hold position. Do not engage. I am dispatching from West Glacier. ETA 45 minutes minimum on that road in the dark." I said, "Copy." I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall under the window. I did not want to be silhouetted in it. Beaumont put his head on my thigh, and we sat there in the dark, and the voice outside changed. It did not change all at once. It changed slowly. It started by getting closer, but not from the direction of the shed. It came from the south side of the cabin now, from the lakeside, and it was no longer a child. It was Roy Delaney's voice, the solo backpacker from the 7th campsite, the man with the sunburn and the McCarthy novel. He said, "Ranger." He said, "Ranger, are you in there?" He said, "Ranger, I came down the trail. I came down the trail because there is something in my campsite. Please open the door." I had spoken to Roy Delaney for less than 4 minutes, 18 hours earlier, 6.5 miles up the lake. The voice on the other side of the cabin door had his exact pitch and his exact rasp and the exact way he closed his T's, the way you do if you grew up in the upper Midwest. It was not a guess at his voice. It was his voice. The way a recording is the voice it captures. He had not walked 6.5 miles in the dark. He had not. Whoever or whatever was out there, it had heard him talk to me at his campsite that afternoon, and it was using what it had heard. I keyed the radio. I said, "Dispatch. The subject outside my cabin is now imitating the voice of a backpacker at Site 7. I am requesting a wellness check on Roy Delaney, Site 7, Bowman Head. Send somebody up that trail at first light." Renata said, "Copy that." She said, "Ralph, talk to me. Keep the line open. Talk to me." I talked to her. I do not remember everything I said. I told her about my grandfather. I told her about Mosul. I told her about the dog I had at home when I was 9, a beagle named Ruckus my father shot when she was hit by a car and her hips were destroyed, and how my father cried after he did it and how I had never seen him cry before that. I talked because Renata had told me to, and because as long as I was talking my own voice filled the cabin, and the voice on the other side of the door could not get in. The voice on the other side of the door tried other voices. It tried my mother's voice. I do not know how. It tried a voice that I think was supposed to be my grandfather's voice, though it got the cadence wrong, because my grandfather had been dead for 9 years by then and the voice could not have heard him for itself. It tried a woman's voice that I did not recognize. It tried Renata's voice. That one was the worst. I had her on the radio in my hand talking to me, while another version of her stood 3 feet from my front door telling me she was hurt, telling me she had driven up from West Glacier and crashed her truck and needed me to come outside. I kept the radio keyed. The voice outside finally went quiet about an hour before dawn. At first light, Renata's team made it up the road in 2 trucks. They did not find anybody. They did not find any tire tracks but their own. They walked the perimeter of my cabin and they found 2 more of those single bare footprints, one in the loose dirt behind the woodshed, one in the gravel of the path down to the dock. The team kept on up the trail to the head of the lake. They reached campsite 7 at noon. Roy Delaney's tent was zipped up. His pack was inside. His boots were outside the tent neatly side by side, the way a man leaves them when he is going to sleep. The McCarthy novel was on top of the pack with a leaf as a bookmark. Roy Delaney was not in the tent. Roy Delaney was not in the campsite. Roy Delaney was not on the trail. They searched for 9 days. They found no body. They found nothing. They never found Roy Delaney. I called Vincent Tuhawk the day they called off the search for Roy Delaney. I want to say something here about why I had not called him sooner. The truth is that I had been afraid to. I had been afraid that what he told me would make it harder to do my job, and I had been afraid that what he told me would make it impossible to leave. There is a kind of knowledge that traps you, do you understand? There is a kind of knowledge that fits over your life like a lid. By the 9th day after Roy Delaney went missing, I no longer had a choice. I had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a week. I had stopped eating my evening meal. I was down 9 pounds. I had taken to keeping Beaumont in the cabin around the clock, and the cabin smelled of dog and unwashed flannel, and the wood smoke that gets into everything in those places. I was not going crazy, I want to be clear about that. I was the same man I had always been. I was simply a man who knew something he had not known before, and who could not put it down. Vincent Tuhawk was 81 years old. He answered his phone on the 3rd ring. His voice had the slow, even rhythm of a man who has spoken the same language his whole life and has nothing to prove with it. I told him who I was. I told him who my grandfather had been. He said he had known my grandfather a little, 50 years ago, at a powwow in Browning. He said my grandfather had been a fine dancer. I told him what was happening at Bowman Lake. He listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. I thought for a moment that the line had dropped. Then he said, "You are not the first ranger to call me about this. You will not be the last." I asked him what was out there. He said, "That depends on who you ask." He said the Salish elders had a name for it. He said the Blackfeet had a name for it. He said the Kootenai had a different name. He said the names did not mean the same thing in any language, because the people who first named the thing had each seen it in slightly different conditions, and each had described what they saw, and the descriptions did not perfectly agree. He said what they all agreed on is this: it does not eat people. Not the way a bear eats people. It is not after meat. I asked him what it was after then. He said it is after the sound of you. It is after the way you talk to your wife. It is after the way you cry out when you are afraid. It collects these things, it learns them. The white biologists you work with would say perhaps that it is a kind of mimic, like a mockingbird or a starling. The old men would say it is something else. The old men would say it is older than people, and that when people came to this country it studied us the way a wolf studies a herd of elk, and it learned what it needed to learn from us, and now it uses what it learned to draw us close. I asked him why it draws people close. If not for meat, then why? He was quiet again. Then he said, "When I worked that cabin in the 80s, I lost a man on my watch. I lost a young man named Philip Whitebear who was 23 years old. He was my partner. We were assigned to that cabin together. He went out on the trail one evening to use the latrine and he did not come back. I searched all night. In the morning I followed his boot prints up the trail. They went 120 yards from the cabin. They stopped. They did not turn around. They did not continue. They simply stopped, in soft ground, in a place where it would have been impossible for him to leave the trail without leaving more prints." He said, "We never found Philip. We searched for 2 weeks. We searched the lake with grappling hooks. We brought in dogs. We brought in a helicopter from Kalispell." He said, "A year later I was back at the cabin. I was alone. I heard Philip's voice outside one night. He was calling to me from the trail. He was telling me about a piece of fishing line he had found in a tree. It was a story he had told me once in life, maybe 2 months before he disappeared, about a piece of monofilament he found tied around a branch above his head when he was hunting in the Mission Mountains. He had told me that story sitting at the table in that cabin. The voice outside was telling it to me again, word for word, including the parts where he had laughed." He said, "I did not go out to it. I sat at the table with my rifle across my knees and I waited until morning." He said, "I have wondered for 40 years whether Philip was still alive somewhere, the way some of those men in the old stories are alive somewhere, kept by the thing the way a child keeps a frog in a jar. I have wondered whether what I heard was him being made to speak, or whether what I heard was simply a recording, a sound the thing had taken from him before it took whatever else it took. I prefer to believe the second thing. I have to prefer to believe the second thing. But I am an old man now, and at night, sometimes, I am no longer sure." I asked him what to do. He said, "Do not answer it. Do not open the door. Do not, under any circumstances, follow a voice into the trees, no matter whose voice it is." He said, "The men who follow do not come back. The men who do not follow are sometimes only damaged. Some of them can keep working. Some of them go home and do not work in the woods again." He said, "You are already changed, Ralph. You will not be the same man when you leave that cabin. The question is whether you leave it as a man at all." He said, "I will tell you one more thing, and then I will let you go. I will tell you the thing my grandmother told me when I went up there as a young man. She said, 'It is not a spirit. It is not a ghost. It is an animal. It is an animal that has learned a trick that no other animal has learned. It is an animal the way a wolf is an animal, the way a badger is an animal. It can be hunted, it can be killed. The old men killed it sometimes. In the old days, the old men killed it with patience and with fire and with the help of other men." He said, "But you are alone, Ralph. You are alone in that cabin. You should not try to hunt it. Do you understand me? You should keep the door closed and you should finish your season and you should put in your transfer in the fall." I told him I understood. I hung up the phone. I sat at the desk for a long time. Beaumont came over and put his head on my knee. The afternoon light through the cabin window was the color of weak tea. Outside the lake was glass again. A loon was calling. The world looked exactly the way it had looked 2 weeks earlier, the day I drove up the road from Polebridge. I got up and I went to the woodshed and I split kindling for an hour, because my hands needed something to do. That night I closed the shutters on every window for the first time. I had not used the shutters before. They were heavy interior shutters, 4x6 pine boards on iron hinges, fitted to the windows by some careful CCC carpenter 90 years ago. I had thought they were a quaint historical detail. I now think the man who built that cabin knew exactly what he was building them for. I closed them. I dropped the bars. I sat by the stove with Beaumont at my feet and I waited. It came at 3 in the morning. This time it had a new voice. It had a voice I had not given it. It had a voice that did not belong to anyone I had ever met or anyone I had ever talked about within range of those trees. It was a young woman's voice, soft, somewhere between a whisper and a breath, and it was right outside the shutter at my left ear, and it said, "I know what your father did to your mother. I know what you did in the alley in Mosul. I know what you put in the river afterward. Open the door. Open the door, Ralph. I am the only one in the world who knows, and I am going to tell." I did not open the door. I sat by the stove and I held my dog and I did not move, and after a long time the voice went away. In the morning I packed my truck. I did not leave that day. I want to say I did. I want to say I was the kind of man who packs his truck and drives out and does not look back, who saves himself, who chooses life. I am not that kind of man. I have never been that kind of man. The same thing that put me in a striker outside Mosul. The same thing that made my grandfather walk back into a house fire to bring out my aunt's wedding album. The same thing that has led the men of my family to most of our deaths and most of our medals. That thing was in me too. And that thing said no. That thing said you have a job to do. That thing said somebody is going to walk up that trail next week and the week after and the week after, and you are not going to leave them to it. So I packed the truck, and then I unpacked the truck, and I sat on the porch and I cried for the first time since I was a boy. I cried for Roy Delaney, whose family I had spoken to twice on the phone that week. A mother in Madison who kept asking me whether her son had had his prayer beads with him when he disappeared. I cried for Philip Whitebear, who I had never met, whose voice an old man in Browning still heard sometimes at night. I cried for whoever the young woman had been whose voice the thing had been wearing the night before, who I now suspected had been one of the women who went missing along the North Fork in the 70s, whose case I had read in the office files my first week. I cried because I had finally understood sitting there on the porch what the thing was actually doing. It was not collecting voices the way a child collects baseball cards. It was collecting them the way you collect bait. Each voice it took, it used to take another. And the voices it could not use directly it stored, against the day a man would come along who could be hurt by them. I called Renata. I told her I was going to finish my season. I told her I needed 2 things. I needed her to send up a second ranger to share the cabin with me. The cabin had a loft, there was room, and I needed her to send up the contents of the case file on every disappearance in that drainage going back to 1932. She did not argue with me. She said she would arrange both. The second ranger was a man in his 50s named Bobby Ironcloud. He had worked the Bob Marshall for 18 years. He had a face like a saddle that has been left out in the weather. He came up the road in his own truck with a duffel and a rifle and a pound of coffee, and he did not ask me a single question for the first 3 days. On the 4th day he asked me to tell him what I had heard. I told him. He listened. He nodded. He said, "My uncle worked Bowman in the 70s. My uncle told me. We do not need to talk about it again unless something happens." We finished the season together. 3 more incidents over the course of the summer. Once in late June, Bobby and I both heard a voice on the dock at dusk that sounded like a small girl singing a hymn. We stayed inside. Once in July, somebody who sounded exactly like Bobby's wife called him from the woodshed. He did not go. Once in August, near the end of the season, the voice tried me again. It used my mother's voice. My mother had died in March. The voice did her well enough that I had to sit down. Bobby put his hand on my shoulder and held it there until I could breathe again. We did not lose a hiker. I want to be clear that we did not save anybody either, in the dramatic sense. There was no battle. We did not hunt the thing. Vincent Two Hawk had told me not to, and I listened to him. We simply held the cabin. We held the door. We turned away every voice that came to us, no matter how true it sounded, no matter what it offered to tell us. Some nights it offered nothing at all. Some nights it whispered the names of people we had wronged and the things we had done that we hoped no one knew. Once it told me, in my grandfather's voice, the exact location of a wallet I had lost when I was 17. It was correct. I do not know how it was correct. I left Bowman Lake in mid-October when the snow started to come down off the divide. I did not put in for the cabin again. The service offered it to me. I declined. They put a man named Johnny Stonebear on it the next summer. He lasted 6 weeks. He came out and he put in his transfer and he never went back to the backcountry, but he was alive. And as far as I know, he is alive still. I am writing this in the apartment in Whitefish I rented after I left the service. Beaumont is asleep on the couch beside me. He is gray in the muzzle now. The window over my desk looks out on a parking lot and a stand of birches and a road that has a gas station at the end of it. And people, and lights, and other voices, real voices, the kind that come out of throats attached to bodies. I take walks in the morning. I do not walk in the woods anymore. I am sorry about that, in a way. The woods were the only place I was ever entirely myself. But I have made my peace with it. There are men who can carry that knowledge back into the trees, and there are men who cannot. And I am the second kind, and there is no shame in knowing which kind of man you are. I am writing this for the next ranger. I do not know who you are. I do not know what name you carry or what reasons brought you to that cabin. I know only that the service will not warn you, because the service has decided for reasons of liability or denial or simple bureaucratic inertia that it is better for each ranger to come at it fresh. I disagree. I am tired of men coming at it fresh. So here is what I want you to know. When you are washing dishes on the porch in the long blue hour and the lake goes still, and a voice comes across the water, do not answer it. Do not shine your light on it. Do not call out to ask who is there. Go inside. Lock the door. Close the shutters. When the voice comes that night, and it will come, do not open the door for it. No matter whose voice it is, no matter what it tells you it knows, no matter what it says is happening on the other side, sit down by the stove. If you have a dog, hold the dog. Wait. Wait for morning. Morning always comes. Even at Bowman, that is all. That is all I can tell you. The thing is real. It is not a spirit. It is not a ghost. It is something the country has carried for a very long time. The way the country carries the wolves and the bears and all the things that were here before us and will be here after us. It is older than your name. It is older than mine. But you have a name. Your grandfather, whoever he was, gave you one, or your mother did, or some kind man at a desk in a hospital wrote one down for you when nobody else came to claim you. You have a name, and the country knows you by it, and the cabin will hold if you do. Hold the cabin. Wait for morning. Ralph Gray Wolf, Whitefish, Montana.